Everyone was gathered in Courtroom 7B, which hummed with a dark frequency of pain that seemed to match the anxiety of everyone gathered within its walls. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, and the Philadelphia County Courthouse was about to become the stage for a trial that would haunt the city for years to come. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice. Inside, a 17-year-old boy named Ethan Caldwell sat at the defense table, his crisp white button-down shirt and navy blazer carefully selected to project innocence, his sandy blonde hair combed neatly to the side in a way that made him look like he'd just stepped out of a prep school catalog. Ethan's father, Richard Caldwell, a prominent real estate developer whose face graced billboards across 3 counties, sat in the front row directly behind his son. His expression was carefully neutral, the kind of blank mask that only comes from years of high-stakes business negotiations and country club poker games. Next to him sat Ethan's mother, Patricia, clutching a designer handbag worth more than most people's monthly rent, her knuckles white with tension despite her composed exterior. The prosecution table told a different story entirely. Assistant District Attorney Monica Reynolds, a black woman in her early 40s with silver-rimmed glasses and an expression that could cut glass, reviewed her notes one final time. Next to her sat 17-year-old Marcus Johnson and his mother, Diane. Marcus's left arm was in a cast, his jaw was wired shut, and a network of faded bruises still discolored the dark skin around his eyes and cheekbones. He'd been handsome once, with a kind of bright smile that lit up every room he entered. Now, 3 months after the incident, he could barely eat solid food, and doctors said he might never regain full vision in his left eye. This wasn't just another assault case. This was the culmination of years of torment, a pattern of escalating violence, and one night that had gone catastrophically wrong. And everyone in that courtroom, from the judge to the court reporter to the handful of journalists allowed inside, knew they were about to witness something that would define the conversation around privilege, racism, and justice for months to come. Judge Margaret Holloway entered with the traditional "all rise," her black robes flowing behind her like the wings of some dark angel of justice. She was in her late 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that had seen too many cases like this one. She'd been a public defender for 15 years before ascending to the bench, and she had a reputation for being fair but absolutely uncompromising when it came to the law. "Please be seated," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made even the most jaded court watchers pay attention. "We're here today in the matter of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Ethan James Caldwell. The defendant is charged with aggravated assault, ethnic intimidation, and conspiracy to commit assault causing serious bodily injury. Mr. Caldwell, do you understand the charges against you?" Ethan stood, his expensive lawyer, Gerald Martinson, rising beside him. Martinson was a legend in Philadelphia legal circles, the kind of attorney who'd gotten DUI charges dismissed for state senators and made weapons charges disappear for the sons of judges. He wore a suit that cost more than most cars and had the silver-tongued confidence of a man who'd rarely lost a case. "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice steady and clear. He'd been coached well. "Look respectful. Sound remorseful without admitting guilt. Make eye contact but don't seem arrogant." It was all a performance and he'd rehearsed his part perfectly. "How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." The words hung in the air like a slap. From the gallery someone gasped. Judge Holloway's gavel came down once, sharp and definitive. "Order. I will have order in this courtroom or I will clear the gallery. Is that understood?" Silence fell like a heavy blanket. "Ms. Reynolds, you may present your opening statement." Monica Reynolds stood, buttoning her blazer with deliberate precision. She walked to the jury box, making eye contact with each of the 12 men and women who would decide Ethan Caldwell's fate. The jury was diverse: 4 black jurors, 3 white, 2 Hispanic, 2 Asian, and 1 who'd identified as mixed race during selection. Reynolds had fought hard for this composition, knowing that in a case steeped in racial hatred, representation mattered. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of righteous anger, "over the next several days, you're going to hear a story that will disturb you." It disturbed me. It should disturb anyone with a conscience. This is not a story about a schoolyard disagreement that got out of hand. This is not a story about teenage boys being boys, as the defense will undoubtedly try to characterize it. This is a story about systematic, calculated, racially motivated violence that culminated in an attack so brutal that Marcus Johnson, an honors student with a full scholarship to Temple University, now faces a lifetime of medical complications and psychological trauma. She paused, letting the words sink in. Several jurors shifted in their seats, their eyes moving to Marcus, who sat perfectly still, his mother's hand resting protectively on his shoulder. The evidence will show that on the night of June 14, Ethan Caldwell and 3 of his friends, Dylan Marchetti, Connor O'Brien, and Trevor Hastings, lured Marcus to an abandoned warehouse in the Fishtown neighborhood under false pretenses. They told him there was a party. They told him there would be girls from Lincoln Prep, the private school they all attended. What they didn't tell him was that they had been planning this attack for weeks, coordinating through encrypted messaging apps, gathering weapons, and choosing a location specifically because it was isolated, because there were no security cameras, because they knew they could hurt him badly and no one would see. Reynolds pulled up a photograph on the courtroom's display screen. It showed Marcus as he'd been that night, photographed by first responders. His face was so swollen it was barely recognizable as human. Blood covered his shirt. His left arm bent at an unnatural angle. The evidence will show that these 4 boys beat Marcus with baseball bats, kicked him repeatedly while he was on the ground, and used racial slurs throughout the entire attack. They took videos on their phones, laughing while Marcus begged them to stop. They urinated on him while he lay unconscious. And when they finally left him there, bleeding and broken on that concrete floor, they went to a diner and ate pancakes. They posted photos on social media of themselves smiling, celebrating with the caption, "Best night ever." The courtroom was utterly silent now. Even the journalists had stopped typing, transfixed by the horror of what Reynolds was describing. Now you're going to hear the defense argue that Ethan Caldwell wasn't the ringleader. They'll try to convince you that he was just present, that he didn't participate in the actual beating, that he shouldn't be held responsible for what his friends did. But ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that this attack was Ethan's idea from the beginning. Text messages recovered from his phone show him planning every detail. Security footage from a sporting goods store shows him purchasing the baseball bats 3 days before the attack. And most damningly, the video footage taken during the assault, which the defense claimed was deleted but which our forensic experts were able to recover, shows Ethan Caldwell not only participating, but directing the violence like some kind of sadistic choreographer. She turned to face Ethan directly. He met her gaze without flinching, his expression carefully blank. It was a calculated move, showing no fear, no shame, nothing that could be interpreted as consciousness of guilt. This case isn't just about what happened on June 14th, Reynolds continued. This is about a pattern of racist bullying that began when Marcus transferred to Lincoln Prep in 9th grade as part of their diversity scholarship program. From his very first day, Ethan Caldwell made Marcus's life hell. Racial slurs in the hallways. Notes left in his locker with images of lynchings. Marcus's backpack stolen and thrown in the trash. His belongings defaced with swastikas and Confederate flags. And when Marcus reported these incidents to school administration, do you know what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because Ethan's father had donated $2 million to build the new athletic center. Because the Caldwell name opens doors in this city. Because boys like Ethan have been taught their entire lives that the rules don't apply to them. She returned to the prosecution table and picked up a thick binder. This binder contains over 200 pages of documented harassment. Text messages. Social media posts. Witness statements from other students who were too afraid to speak up until now. You will see a clear escalation of violence, leading inevitably to that night in June when Ethan Caldwell decided that harassment wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to hurt Marcus. He wanted to break him. He wanted to send a message to every black student at Lincoln Prep that they didn't belong, that they would never be equals, that their very presence was an insult to be answered with violence. Reynolds placed the binder down and looked at each juror again. At the end of this trial, after you've heard all the evidence, after you've seen the videos and read the messages and listened to the witnesses, I'm going to ask you to find Ethan Caldwell guilty on all charges. Not because it will give Marcus back his health or his scholarship or the future that was stolen from him. Not because it will erase the trauma of what he endured. But because justice demands it. Because the law demands it. Because every person in this city, regardless of the color of their skin or the size of their parents' bank account, deserves to be safe. Thank you. She sat down, and the weight of her words seemed to press down on the entire courtroom. Several jurors were taking notes. Others stared at Ethan with undisguised hostility. One older white woman in the front row of the jury box had tears in her eyes. Judge Holloway turned to the defense table. Mr. Martinson, your opening statement. Gerald Martinson stood with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd won far more cases than he'd lost. He was in his 60s, with perfectly styled silver hair and the kind of tan that suggested frequent vacations to tropical climates. When he smiled at the jury, it was the practiced smile of a man who knew exactly how to charm. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice warm and conversational, like he was talking to friends over dinner rather than arguing for a client facing decades in prison. "My colleague Ms. Reynolds has painted a very dramatic picture for you. And I don't dispute that what happened to Marcus Johnson was terrible. Was a tragedy. A horrible, inexcusable act of violence. But here's what Ms. Reynolds didn't tell you. My client didn't do it." He let that hang in the air for a moment, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "Oh, Ethan was there that night. He admits that. He was present at that warehouse. But being present at a crime is not the same as committing a crime. And over the course of this trial, the evidence will show that Ethan Caldwell tried to stop what happened. He argued with Dylan Marchetti and Connor O'Brien when they started getting violent. He told them to leave Marcus alone. And when the beating began, Ethan didn't participate. He stood to the side, horrified by what his so-called friends were doing, too shocked and frightened to know how to intervene effectively." Several jurors looked skeptical. Martinson noted their expressions and adjusted his approach. "Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, if he was so horrified, why didn't he call the police? Why didn't he try harder to stop them?" And those are fair questions. But I want you to remember that we're talking about a 17-year-old boy. A child, really, despite his physical size. A teenager who suddenly found himself in a situation spiraling out of control, surrounded by violent, aggressive peers, unsure what to do. Have you ever been in a situation where things happened so fast you couldn't process it? Where fear paralyzed you? That's what happened to Ethan that night. Martinson picked up a remote and clicked to display a different image on the screen. Ethan's school photo, showing him with a gentle smile, looking more like a college-bound student than an accused violent criminal. The prosecution wants you to believe that Ethan is some kind of mastermind, a calculating racist who planned this attack for weeks. But the evidence simply doesn't support that narrative. Yes, there were text messages. But context matters. Those messages, when you actually read them in full rather than the cherry-picked excerpts the prosecution provided, show a group of teenage boys engaging in the kind of stupid, thoughtless banter that teenagers engage in. They made offensive jokes. They said things they shouldn't have said. But there's a vast difference between offensive speech, which is protected by the First Amendment however distasteful we might find it, and actual criminal conspiracy. He clicked to another slide showing a timeline. As for the baseball bats, yes, Ethan purchased them. But the evidence will show he bought them for a legitimate purpose. His younger brother's Little League team needed new equipment. The prosecution has taken an innocent transaction and twisted it to fit their predetermined narrative of guilt. Monica Reynolds started to rise, objecting, but Judge Holloway held up a hand. "Save it for cross-examination, counselor." Martinson continued, warming to his theme. "And let's talk about this supposed pattern of racist harassment. Lincoln Prep is one of the most progressive, inclusive private schools in Philadelphia. They have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. They have diversity training. They have counselors and administrators specifically tasked with addressing any complaints of harassment. If Ethan had truly been engaging in a years-long campaign of racist bullying, don't you think the school would have noticed? Don't you think there would have been disciplinary action?" He paused, making eye contact with several jurors who seemed to be reconsidering their initial reactions. The truth is that Marcus and Ethan had a complicated relationship. They competed academically. They both played basketball. There was rivalry, yes. There was friction. But rivalry between teenagers, even when it occasionally crosses lines of good taste, is not a criminal conspiracy. And the prosecution cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Ethan planned or participated in the assault on Marcus Johnson. Martinson's voice took on a more somber tone. What happened to Marcus was horrific. No one deserves to be beaten the way he was beaten. No one deserves to have their future compromised by violence. And the young men who actually committed that violence will face justice. Dylan Marchetti has already pleaded guilty and is cooperating with the prosecution. Connor O'Brien and Trevor Hastings will have their own trials. But Ethan Caldwell is not guilty of these charges, and when you've heard all the evidence, when you've considered it carefully and without prejudice, I believe you'll agree with me. Thank you. He returned to his seat, and Ethan gave him an almost imperceptible nod. It was a good opening, Martinson knew. Not great. No opening statement could be great when the facts were this ugly, but good enough to plant seeds of doubt. And reasonable doubt was all they needed. Judge Holloway checked her watch. "We'll take a 15-minute recess before the prosecution calls its first witness." The gavel came down, and the courtroom erupted in hushed conversation. Journalists rushed to file their initial reports. Ethan's parents leaned forward to whisper to their son. And Marcus sat perfectly still, his good hand clenched into a fist, his mother's arm around his shoulders, watching the boy who had destroyed his life laugh quietly with his expensive attorney as if this was all just another day at the office. What none of them knew, what no one in that courtroom could have anticipated, was that the truth of what happened that night was far darker than either the prosecution or the defense suspected. And before this trial was over, a detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, would blow the case wide open and reveal secrets that would shock even the most cynical observers. But that revelation was still days away. For now, the trial would proceed according to plan, with each side presenting their version of events, building their narrative, trying to win the hearts and minds of 12 ordinary citizens tasked with an extraordinary responsibility. The 15-minute recess stretched to 20 as Judge Holloway dealt with some procedural matter in her chambers. In the courthouse hallway, Marcus's mother Diane held her son close, whispering encouragements. She was a woman who'd worked 2 jobs to give her son opportunities, a woman who'd sacrificed everything to move them out of their rough neighborhood into a better school district, a woman who'd believed that education and hard work could overcome the barriers of race and class. That faith had been shattered on June 14th. "You're doing so good, baby," she whispered. "Just keep holding on. Truth's gonna come out." Marcus wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the system would work, that justice existed, that Ethan Caldwell would face consequences for what he'd done. But he'd spent the last 3 months watching Ethan walk free on bail, seeing him post on social media from beach vacations and family dinners, living his life as if nothing had happened while Marcus underwent surgery after surgery, physical therapy, counseling sessions where he woke up screaming from nightmares of being held down while fists and feet rained down on his body. Across the hallway, Ethan stood with his parents and attorney, looking far less confident than he had in the courtroom. His father was whispering harshly, too quiet for anyone else to hear, but his expression made clear he was not pleased. "I don't care what that prosecutor says," Richard Caldwell hissed. "You stick to the story. You were there but you didn't participate. You tried to stop them. That's it. Nothing else. You understand me?" "Dad, Do you understand me, Ethan?" Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. His mother squeezed his hand but said nothing. She perfected the art of supportive silence years ago. Martinson checked his phone, scrolling through messages. One was from his investigator, Jeremy Tate, who'd been digging into Marcus's background looking for anything they could use to undermine his credibility. The message read, "Found something interesting. Call me ASAP." He made a mental note to return the call during lunch recess. In cases like this, you used every tool available. If Marcus had any skeletons in his closet, a juvenile record that should have been sealed but wasn't, a social media post that could be taken out of context, a witness who could testify to him starting fights at his old school, Martinson would use it. That was his job. Not to determine innocence or guilt, but to defend his client using every legal means available. Back in the courtroom, Monica Reynolds was reviewing her witness list with her paralegal, a sharp young woman named Tasha who'd worked on building this case from day one. "First up is Officer Braddock," Reynolds murmured. "He's solid. Emotional but professional. Then we'll go with the ER doctor to establish the extent of injuries. After lunch, we bring in some of the Lincoln Prep students to establish the pattern of harassment. Save the forensic tech who recovered the videos for day 2. "What about Dylan Marchetti?" Tasha asked. "He's our strongest witness since he was actually there and he's pleaded guilty." Day 3, Reynolds decided. "I want to build the circumstantial case first so when Dylan testifies and confirms everything, it feels inevitable. Plus, Martinson's going to eviscerate him on cross. Better to have the foundation solid before we expose the jury to that." "And Marcus?" Reynolds glanced over at the young man sitting with his mother. "Last. I want Marcus to be the final voice the jury hears before we rest. After they've seen all the evidence, heard all the witnesses, I want them to hear directly from Marcus about what Ethan did to him. About what he's lost. About what he'll never get back." The bailiff called them back into the courtroom. Judge Holloway returned, and the trial resumed with clinical efficiency. "Ms. Reynolds, call your first witness." The people call Officer James Braddock. A uniformed police officer in his mid-30s took the stand, his posture military straight, his expression carefully neutral. He'd been a cop for 12 years, working out of the 26th district, and he'd seen plenty of ugly things in his career. But what he'd found in that warehouse still haunted him. After being sworn in, Reynolds approached the witness stand. "Officer Braddock, can you tell us about the events of June 14th? "Yes, ma'am." "At approximately 11:47 p.m., we received a 911 call reporting screams coming from an abandoned warehouse on East Columbia Avenue. My partner, Officer Kim Lee, and I were in the area, so we responded. We arrived on scene at 11:52 p.m. What did you find? Braddock's jaw tightened. We found the victim, later identified as Marcus Johnson, lying unconscious on the concrete floor of the warehouse. He was covered in blood. His breathing was shallow and irregular. There was significant swelling to his face and head. His left arm appeared to be broken. We immediately called for an ambulance and began administering first aid. What else did you observe at the scene? There were multiple blood pools on the floor, suggesting the victim had been moved or had tried to crawl to different locations. We found 2 wooden baseball bats lying nearby, both with blood on them. There were also several beer cans and what appeared to be the remains of a small bonfire made from cardboard and trash. Reynolds introduced photos of the scene into evidence. The jury members looked at them and several visibly recoiled. Did you find anything else, officer? Yes, ma'am. Approximately 15 feet from where we found the victim, we discovered a cell phone partially hidden under some debris. It was later determined to belong to Connor O'Brien, one of the defendants. What was the victim's condition when the ambulance arrived? Critical. The paramedics told us he'd likely have died if we'd arrived even 10 minutes later. He'd lost a significant amount of blood, and they were concerned about brain swelling and internal injuries. Did you have any other interactions related to this case that night? Braddock nodded. At approximately 2:30 a.m., we were called to a diner about 2 miles from the warehouse. The manager had called 911 because 4 young men were acting strange, laughing loudly. One of them had what appeared to be blood on his clothing. When we arrived, we found Ethan Caldwell, Dylan Marchetti, Connor O'Brien, and Trevor Hastings sitting in a booth. Marchetti had visible blood spatter on his shirt and shoes. Did they resist arrest? No, ma'am. Actually, Caldwell was very calm. He asked what the problem was, said they'd just been out celebrating the end of exams. When we told them they needed to come down to the station for questioning, he asked if he could call his father first. And did you allow that? No, ma'am. We read them their rights and transported them to the station. Reynolds nodded, satisfied. No further questions, Your Honor. Martinson stood for cross-examination, approaching the witness with a friendly smile. Officer Braddock, you've been a police officer for 12 years, is that correct? Yes, sir. And in those 12 years, you've undoubtedly learned that things aren't always as they first appear, haven't you? Braddock looked wary. I'm not sure what you mean. Well, let me ask you this. When you found my client and his friends at the diner, did any of them try to run? No, sir. Did any of them act guilty or afraid? I wouldn't say afraid, no. In fact, my client was cooperative, wasn't he? He asked legitimate questions about why he was being detained, but he didn't resist or try to flee. That's correct. And when you say Mr. Marchetti had blood on his clothing, you're talking about relatively small amounts, aren't you? Not like someone had bathed in blood. There were visible stains, but no, it wasn't an excessive amount. Officer Braddock, how many people were present at that diner when you arrived? Braddock frowned, thinking. The restaurant was fairly busy. Maybe 15 or 20 other patrons. And had anyone else called the police? Had anyone else reported these 4 young men as suspicious? Just the manager. So these young men weren't hiding, weren't acting secretive, weren't behaving in a way that multiple people found alarming enough to call the police? Just the manager called, Braddock repeated. And when you searched my client, you didn't find any weapons on him, did you? No, sir. No blood on his clothing? No, sir. No injuries to his hands consistent with someone who'd been in a fight? No visible injuries, no. Martinson nodded, driving the point home. So based on your observations at the diner, there was nothing about Ethan Caldwell specifically that indicated he'd participated in a violent assault, was there? Reynolds stood. Objection. Calls for speculation. Officer Braddock isn't a forensic expert. Sustained, Judge Holloway ruled. Rephrase, Mr. Martinson. Officer Braddock, you testified that you found blood on Mr. Marchetti's clothing. Did you observe similar blood evidence on my client? No, sir, I did not. Thank you. Nothing further. Braddock stepped down and Reynolds called her next witness. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, the emergency room physician who treated Marcus when he arrived at Temple University Hospital. Dr. Okonkwo was a Nigerian immigrant in her 50s, with close-cropped hair starting to gray at the temples and the calm, authoritative presence of someone who'd spent decades dealing with life-and-death situations. She took the oath and settled into the witness chair with practiced ease. Reynolds established her credentials: medical degree from Johns Hopkins, 15 years in emergency medicine, countless trauma cases, and then moved to the heart of the matter. Dr. Okonkwo, what was Marcus Johnson's condition when he arrived at your emergency room? Severe, she replied, her accent carrying the crisp precision of British colonial education overlaid on native Nigerian speech patterns. The patient presented with multiple traumatic injuries including a fractured left radius and ulna, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, significant facial trauma with a fractured orbital socket, and a grade 3 concussion. There was also extensive soft tissue damage, contusions, lacerations, and hematomas covering approximately 40% of his body surface. Can you translate that into layman's terms for the jury? His left arm was broken in 2 places. 3 ribs were fractured, and one of those fractures had punctured his lung, causing it to partially collapse. The bones around his left eye were shattered. He had a serious concussion with some brain swelling. And he was covered in bruises, cuts, and internal bleeding from head to toe. Several jurors winced. One woman in the back row put her hand over her mouth. In your professional opinion, what caused these injuries? Blunt force trauma consistent with being struck repeatedly with a heavy object and with fists and feet. The pattern of injuries suggested multiple attackers and a sustained assault lasting several minutes. What treatment did you provide? We immediately intubated him because of the lung injury. That means we put a tube down his throat to help him breathe. We gave him blood transfusions because he'd lost so much blood. We performed emergency surgery to set his broken arm and repair the lung damage. A plastic surgeon was called in to address the facial fractures. We kept him in the ICU for 6 days. What is the prognosis for his recovery? Dr. Okonkwo's expression grew somber. The physical injuries will heal mostly. The bones will mend, though he'll likely have arthritis in his arm as he ages. The lung function should return to near normal. But the orbital fracture was severe. There's permanent damage to the optic nerve. His vision in his left eye is significantly impaired and will not improve. Additionally, the concussion was serious enough that he may experience ongoing cognitive issues, difficulty concentrating, memory problems, increased susceptibility to future head injuries. In other words, the injuries Marcus sustained that night will affect him for the rest of his life. Yes, that's correct. No further questions. Martinson approached for cross-examination, his manner respectful but probing. Dr. Okonkwo, you're clearly an excellent physician, and I don't mean to question your medical expertise. But I do want to clarify something. When Marcus arrived at your emergency room, you didn't see who caused his injuries, correct? Obviously not. So you can't tell this jury that my client specifically caused any of those injuries? I can tell the jury that the patient was severely beaten by multiple people. But you can't identify who those people were, can you? No. And when you describe the injuries as consistent with being struck by a heavy object, that's based on the pattern of bruising and fractures, not on actually witnessing the assault? That's the nature of emergency medicine, counselor. I treat the injuries and infer the cause based on medical evidence. But inference isn't the same as fact, is it? Reynolds stood. Objection. Argumentative. Sustained. Move on, Mr. Martinson. You changed tactics. Dr. Okonkwo, in your report, you noted that Marcus had alcohol in his system when he arrived. Isn't that correct? Yes, his blood alcohol content was 0.06%. So he'd been drinking that night. He had consumed alcohol, yes. But 0.06 is below the legal limit for driving and would not significantly impair judgment in most adults. But it does indicate he'd been drinking at what the prosecution characterized as a supposed ambush. Doesn't that suggest he thought he was going to a party, just like the defendants claimed? I can't speculate about what the patient thought. I can only testify about his medical condition. Martinson sensed he'd pushed as far as he could. Thank you, doctor. Nothing further. The morning wore on with additional witnesses establishing the forensic evidence. A crime scene technician testified about the blood evidence and the recovery of the baseball bats. A DNA analyst confirmed that blood on the bats matched Marcus's DNA profile. Each piece of evidence was carefully introduced, photographed, labeled, and added to the growing mountain of proof that something terrible had happened in that warehouse. By noon, when Judge Holloway called for lunch recess, the jury had seen enough blood and heard enough medical testimony that several looked vaguely ill. Ethan sat at the defense table looking unaffected, which was either a testament to his innocence, as Martinson would argue, or his sociopathy, as Reynolds believed. During the lunch break, Martinson finally returned his investigator's call. Jeremy, what did you find? So I've been digging into Marcus Johnson's background like you asked. Jeremy Tate's voice came through the phone, carrying the satisfied tone of someone who'd uncovered something useful. Kid's pretty clean honestly. Good grades, no criminal record, volunteers at a youth center in his old neighborhood. But I found something interesting in his social media from about 2 years ago. What kind of something? Posts about reverse racism, criticism of affirmative action, calling white people devils, that kind of thing. Nothing illegal but definitely inflammatory. Could be useful for establishing that there was mutual animosity, not just one-sided racial harassment. Martinson frowned. How old are these posts? Like I said, about 2 years ago. He was 15. Anything recent? No, actually. His social media's been pretty bland for the last year. Mostly about school, basketball, that kind of thing. But those old posts are still there. He never deleted them. Martinson considered this. Using a 15-year-old's inflammatory social media posts to undermine his credibility after he'd been brutally beaten was exactly the kind of thing that could backfire spectacularly if the jury thought it was victim-blaming. But it could also plant seeds of doubt about the narrative that Marcus was a completely innocent victim targeted solely because of his race. Send me screenshots, he decided. I'll think about whether to use them. Already in your email. Anything else? Still working on Connor O'Brien's phone records. The kid was sloppy about what he deleted. Might have more for you in a day or two. Good. Keep digging. Martinson ended the call and pulled up his email, scrolling through the screenshots Jeremy had sent. The posts were definitely inflammatory. White people been stealing and killing for centuries and now they want to act like victims. One read. Another said, affirmative action isn't racism, it's payback. Ugly sentiments, Martinson thought, but not unexpected from a black teenager growing up in America, experiencing racism and finding his voice on social media. And certainly not evidence that Marcus had somehow deserved what happened to him. Still, perception mattered. If he could establish that there was animosity on both sides, it might soften the narrative of Ethan as a one-dimensional racist villain. He was still considering his strategy when court reconvened at 1:30 p.m. Ms. Reynolds, call your next witness, Judge Holloway instructed. The people call Amber Richardson. A young black woman, maybe 18 or 19, walked nervously to the witness stand. She wore a conservative dress and kept her eyes down as she was sworn in. This was Amber's first time testifying in court, and her hands trembled slightly as she took her seat. Reynolds approached gently. Amber, can you tell the jury how you know the defendant? We go to Lincoln Prep together. Same grade. And do you know Marcus Johnson? Yes. We've been friends since freshman year. Can you tell the jury about an incident that occurred in March of this year involving the defendant and Marcus? Amber's voice was quiet, and Judge Holloway had to ask her to speak up. It was during lunch, Amber said louder now. Marcus was sitting with me and some other kids at our usual table. Ethan and his friends walked by, and Ethan accidentally bumped Marcus's lunch tray, knocking his food all over him. When Marcus stood up, Ethan said. She paused, looking uncomfortable. It's all right, Reynolds encouraged. Please tell the jury what he said. He said, watch where you're going, N-word. But he didn't say N-word. He used the actual slur. The courtroom fell silent. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably. What happened next? Reynolds asked. Marcus just stood there. He was covered in food, spaghetti and sauce all over his shirt. Ethan and his friends were laughing. I could see Marcus was trying not to cry, not to give them the satisfaction. He just grabbed his bag and left. Went to the bathroom to clean up. Did you or Marcus report this incident to school administration? Marcus did. He went to the vice principal, Mr. Henderson. I went with him to back up his story. And what was the result of that report? Amber's expression hardened. Nothing. Mr. Henderson said it was, he said, and that without video evidence he couldn't discipline Ethan based just on our word. He suggested that maybe Marcus had misheard, that maybe Ethan had said something else that just sounded like a slur. He basically called us liars. How did that make you feel? Martinson stood. Objection. Relevance. The witness's feelings aren't material to. I'll allow it, Judge Holloway interrupted. The witness may answer. Amber looked directly at the jury. It made me feel like the school didn't care. Like we could report these things happening over and over, and nothing would ever change because Ethan's family has money and influence. It made me feel like Marcus and I and every other scholarship student at Lincoln Prep was there on sufferance, and we'd better keep our heads down and accept whatever happened to us. Thank you, Amber. Can you describe other incidents you witnessed? Over the next 20 minutes, Amber detailed a pattern of harassment that was systematic and cruel. Ethan and his friends would walk behind Marcus in the hallways making monkey sounds. They'd post edited photos of Marcus with racist imagery on private group chats that would inevitably get shared. They'd bump into him, step on his shoes, accidentally slam their lockers into him as he walked past. And through it all, the school administration did nothing. Did this harassment ever become physical before June 14th? Reynolds asked. Once in sophomore year. Marcus and Ethan both played basketball. During practice, Ethan elbowed Marcus in the face during a drill. Broke his nose. The coach said it was an accident, just an aggressive play. But I saw Ethan's face afterward. He was smiling. Reynolds let that image settle over the jury. No further questions. Martinson approached Amber with a sympathetic expression that didn't reach his eyes. Ms. Richardson, you described yourself as Marcus's friend, correct? Yes. A close friend? Yes. So it's fair to say you care about Marcus and want to see him get justice? Of course. And you believe my client is responsible for what happened to him? I know he is. But you weren't at the warehouse that night, were you? No. So you didn't witness the assault? No, but... Thank you. So your testimony here today is based on what you believe happened, not what you know happened. Correct. Amber's jaw tightened. I know Ethan tormented Marcus for years. I know it got worse and worse. I know that on June 14th, Marcus got a text from someone he thought was a girl he liked, telling him to come to a party. And I know he ended up beaten nearly to death. So yeah, I believe Ethan was involved. But belief and knowledge are different things, aren't they, Ms. Richardson? Objection, Reynolds called out. Argumentative. Sustained. Martinson switched directions. You mentioned that you reported incidents to school administration and felt they didn't take your complaints seriously. Isn't it possible that the administration investigated and simply didn't find enough evidence to support your accusations? They didn't want to find evidence, Amber shot back. They wanted to protect their image and their donors. That's speculation, isn't it? It's the truth. Ms. Richardson, have you ever heard Marcus say negative things about white students at Lincoln Prep? Amber frowned. What do you mean? Have you ever heard him express anger toward white people in general? If he did, can you blame him? After everything he went through? Please just answer the question. Has Marcus ever expressed hostility toward white people? Amber hesitated. He was angry, yeah. Frustrated. But that's not the same as... Thank you. No further questions. As Amber left the witness stand, she shot Ethan a look of pure hatred. He met her gaze without expression, which only seemed to infuriate her more. The afternoon continued with more witnesses from Lincoln Prep. A teacher testified about finding racist graffiti in Marcus's textbook. Another student described seeing Ethan and his friends follow Marcus through the parking lot, shouting slurs. A guidance counselor testified about Marcus coming to her office in tears, saying he didn't feel safe at school. Each piece of testimony added to the portrait Reynolds was painting. Ethan Caldwell as a calculating racist bully who had made Marcus's life hell for years before escalating to attempted murder. But Martinson was effective on cross-examination, poking holes where he could. The teacher couldn't prove Ethan had written the graffiti. The student who saw the parking lot incident admitted he'd been 50 yards away and couldn't hear clearly what was being said. The guidance counselor acknowledged that Marcus had never specifically named Ethan as his primary tormentor, only described certain students, making him uncomfortable. By the time Judge Holloway adjourned for the day at 5 p.m., both sides had scored points, but neither had delivered a knockout blow. The jury filed out looking tired and troubled, the weight of what they were being asked to decide evident in their expressions. Outside the courthouse, protesters had grown in number. Some held signs supporting Marcus, demanding justice, calling for hate crime enhancements. Others, fewer but more vocal, held signs supporting Ethan, claiming he was being railroaded, that the case was about reverse racism and discrimination against white defendants. Police kept the two groups separated, but the tension was thick enough to cut. Ethan left through a side entrance, surrounded by his family and legal team. Reporters shouted questions that went unanswered. His father kept a protective hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward a waiting black SUV with tinted windows. Marcus and his mother left through the front, making a brief statement to the press. Diane spoke while Marcus stood beside her, still and silent. "We trust the justice system," she said, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "We trust that the jury will see the truth and hold accountable those responsible for what was done to my son. Marcus has lost so much. His health, his scholarship, his sense of safety. But he hasn't lost his dignity or his faith that right will prevail. Thank you." They pushed through the crowd toward their car, An older Honda that looked out of place among the luxury vehicles filling the courthouse parking garage. That night, both legal teams worked late preparing for day 2. Reynolds and her team reviewed the testimony of their witnesses, identifying what had worked and what needed adjustment. Tasha pulled up the forensic reports on the cell phone data, ensuring they had everything organized for when they called the digital forensics expert. "We're doing good," Reynolds said, rubbing her tired eyes. "The pattern evidence is strong. Once we get Dylan on the stand to confirm Ethan's direct involvement, we'll be in solid shape." "What about the videos?" Tasha asked. "When are we showing those?" "Day 3, right before Dylan testifies. I want the jury to see with their own eyes what happened, and then immediately hear from someone who was there confirming that Ethan orchestrated the whole thing." Across town, Martinson sat in his home office, a glass of expensive scotch at his elbow, reviewing his strategy. The prosecution's case was strong, he had to admit. Stronger than he'd hoped. The pattern evidence was damning, and once they showed the recovered videos, things would get very difficult. His phone buzzed with a text from Jeremy Tate. "Found something in Connor's deleted texts. Call me." Martinson dialed immediately. "What do you have?" "So Connor's phone records show a lot of back and forth with Dylan Marchetti in the days before the assault," Jeremy said. "Most of it's the typical teenage bullshit. Plans to buy beer, talking about girls, whatever. But I found one exchange from June 12, 2 days before the attack. Connor texts Dylan, 'Is he really serious about this or just talking shit again?' And Dylan responds, 'Dude, serious. Already bought the equipment. Says it's time someone taught that scholarship N-word his place.'" Martinson's mind raced. This was potentially useful. It suggested that Ethan had a reputation for talking shit without following through, which could support their argument that he hadn't actually intended for the assault to happen, that he'd been caught up in something that spiraled beyond his control. What else? "That's the interesting part." Connor responds, "Ick man feels too far. What if he dies?" And Dylan says, "He won't die. We just gonna scare him. He promised nobody gets seriously hurt." This was gold. Evidence that Ethan had specifically said no one would get seriously hurt, which could support an argument that he'd lost control of the situation, that the others had exceeded his intentions. "Can you authenticate these texts for trial?" "Already working on it. Should have everything you need by tomorrow afternoon." "Good. This might be what we need to create reasonable doubt on the aggravated assault charge. If we can show the jury that Ethan's intention was just to scare Marcus, not to nearly kill him, we might be able to get them to convict on a lesser charge." It wasn't a victory. Ethan would still likely face prison time on reduced charges, but it was better than life sentences on the current charges. The next morning, day 2 of the trial began with the prosecution calling their digital forensics expert, a middle-aged man named Dr. Robert Chin who wore a bow tie and had the enthusiastic demeanor of someone who genuinely loved his highly technical job. After establishing his credentials, PhD in computer science, 15 years doing forensic analysis for law enforcement, Reynolds walked him through his examination of the phones seized from Ethan and his co-defendants. "Dr. Chin, can you explain what you found on Ethan Caldwell's phone?" "Certainly." The defendant had deleted a significant amount of data from his phone in the hours after the assault. However, deleted data doesn't immediately disappear from a device's memory. Using forensic recovery software, I was able to retrieve most of what had been erased. "What did you recover?" Dr. Chin pulled up exhibits on the courtroom screen. Text messages, photos, and videos. The messages showed planning for what the defendants called the party. Starting approximately 3 weeks before June 14th, there were group chat messages between the defendant and the 3 co-defendants discussing how to lure the victim to an isolated location. Reynolds introduced a series of text message screenshots. The jury read them and several faces hardened. "Ethan, found the perfect spot. Old warehouse on Columbia. Nobody around at night." "Dylan, how we getting Marcus there?" "Ethan, leave that to me. I'll have Trevor's cousin pretend to be that girl from North Prep he likes. Set up a fake Insta. Invite him to party." "Connor, this is really happening?" "Ethan, told you I was serious. Kid needs to learn he doesn't belong at our school." The messages continued, showing Ethan coordinating every detail. When to strike. What weapons to bring. How to make sure there were no witnesses. "Dr. Chen," Reynolds continued, "you also recovered video files from Connor O'Brien's phone. Can you describe those?" "Yes. There were 3 video files, totaling approximately 8 minutes of footage. The videos show the assault on the victim." "Your Honor," Reynolds said, "at this time the people would like to show those videos to the jury." I warn the court that the content is extremely disturbing. Judge Holloway looked at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to see graphic content. If you need a moment, please indicate so. However, I will remind you that your duty as jurors requires you to review all evidence, no matter how unpleasant. None of the jurors asked for a delay, though several looked apprehensive. The lights dimmed slightly and the screen filled with shaky cell phone footage. The video showed Marcus entering the warehouse, smiling, looking around for the party he'd been promised. The camera angle suggested it was being filmed from a hidden position. As Marcus moved deeper into the building, four figures emerged from the shadows. "Hey Marcus," Ethan's voice unmistakable. "Looking for something?" Marcus turned, confused. "Ethan? What are you doing here? I thought this was a party?" "Nah man, party's just for us. And you're the entertainment." Marcus started to back away, sensing danger. But the others had already moved to cut off the exits. Dylan held a baseball bat. So did Connor. Trevor had what looked like a length of chain. "Wait, come on, this isn't funny," Marcus said, his voice rising with fear. "Whatever joke this is." "No joke," Ethan said. The camera caught his face clearly, his expression twisted with hatred. "You really thought you belonged at Lincoln? You really thought we'd just accept some diversity hire N-word walking around like he owns the place?" Marcus tried to run. Trevor swung the chain, catching him in the back. He fell hard and then they were on him. The video became chaotic. Screaming, the sound of impacts, Marcus begging them to stop. Connor was filming, his angle catching everything. Dylan swinging the bat down on Marcus's arm. Trevor kicking him in the ribs. And Ethan standing over him, directing traffic like a conductor. "Get his face," Ethan's voice. "Make sure he remembers this every time he looks in a mirror." Dylan swung the bat at Marcus's head. The sound was sickening. Marcus's screams became gurgles. "That's enough," Ethan said finally. "Don't want to kill him. Just want him to remember his place." The video showed Marcus lying motionless in a pool of blood. One of them, the angle made it impossible to tell who, urinated on him while the others laughed. Then the video ended. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Several jurors were crying. One woman in the back row looked like she might be sick. The court reporter had stopped typing, her hands frozen over the keys, her face pale. Judge Holloway's voice was hoarse when she spoke. "We'll take a 10-minute recess." The gavel came down, but nobody moved for a long moment. Then the bailiff helped the sick-looking juror out of the room. Diane Johnson held her son, both of them shaking with suppressed sobs. Marcus had seen the video before, had been forced to relive that night multiple times in preparation for trial, but seeing it again in this context, surrounded by strangers, having his violation displayed for public consumption, it was almost more than he could bear. Ethan sat at the defense table looking down at his hands. His face had gone white. His mother was crying quietly. His father stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might break. Martinson leaned close to Ethan, whispering urgently. Whatever he said, Ethan shook his head sharply. The attorney sat back, frustrated. When court reconvened, Reynolds continued her direct examination of Dr. Chin, establishing the chain of custody for the videos, confirming they hadn't been edited or tampered with, entering them formally into evidence. Then she rested, letting the horror of what the jury had seen speak for itself. Martinson approached for cross-examination, knowing he had to do something to mitigate the damage but unsure what could possibly help at this point. "Dr. Chin, in the videos, did you see my client physically strike Marcus Johnson?" Dr. Chin consulted his notes. The defendant is seen directing the others and standing over the victim, but the angle and movement make it difficult to determine definitively whether he personally struck the victim. "So you cannot testify with certainty that my client hit Marcus?" "I can testify that he was present, that he was clearly in a leadership role, and that he encouraged the violence. Whether his hands personally made contact with the victim, I cannot say with 100% certainty. It was a small distinction, but it was all Martinson had." "Thank you." Nothing further. The prosecution rested for the day, and Judge Holloway dismissed the jury early, recognizing that they needed time to process what they'd seen. That evening, Martinson had a difficult conversation with his client and the client's father. "That video is devastating," he said bluntly, sitting in the Caldwell family's home library, surrounded by first-edition books that Richard Caldwell had probably never read. "The jury saw you orchestrating a brutal, racially motivated assault. They heard you use slurs. They watched Marcus beg for mercy while you stood there directing the violence." "But I didn't hit him," Ethan protested. "You heard the expert. He couldn't say I personally struck Marcus." "That doesn't matter." Martinson's professional composure cracked slightly. You were the ringleader. You planned it, you lured him there, you directed the others. Legally, you're just as guilty as if you'd swung the bat yourself. More guilty, actually, because you orchestrated the whole thing. Richard Caldwell set down his glass of bourbon carefully. What are our options? Limited. Very limited. The prosecution's case is stronger than I anticipated. Much stronger. That video. He trailed off, shaking his head. I've defended a lot of people, Mr. Caldwell, but that video is going to haunt those jurors. They're not going to forget it, and they're going to want someone to pay. So what do you recommend? Martinson took a deep breath. I recommend we approach the prosecution about a plea deal. If we plead guilty to reduced charges, maybe drop the ethnic intimidation, reduce the aggravated assault to simple assault, we might be able to negotiate something in the range of 10 to 15 years instead of the life sentence Ethan's facing if convicted on all charges. No, Ethan said immediately. I'm not pleading guilty. Ethan. I said no. I didn't do anything wrong. Marcus was. Don't, Martinson interrupted sharply. Don't finish that sentence. Don't say anything that even sounds like you're justifying what happened. Because there is no justification. None. And if you can't understand that, then you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. Richard Caldwell studied his son for a long moment. Ethan, Mr. Martinson is trying to help you. If he thinks a plea deal is the best option. I'm not admitting to something I didn't do, Ethan insisted. I was there, okay? I admit that. But I didn't want Marcus to get hurt that badly. I just wanted to scare him, to put him in his place. The others took it too far. That's not my fault. Martinson and Richard exchanged glances. The attorney recognized that denial wasn't just legal strategy. Ethan genuinely seemed to believe his own narrative, that he bore no real responsibility for what had happened. All right, Martinson said finally. Then we proceed to trial. But I'm telling you both right now, the odds of acquittal are very, very low. And when Dylan Marchetti takes the stand, which he will because his plea deal requires him to testify, he's going to confirm that this was all your idea. He's going to say you planned it, organized it, and reveled in it. The jury is going to convict. Then make them doubt, Richard Caldwell said coldly. That's what we pay you for. Find a way to create reasonable doubt. I'll do my best. But reasonable doubt is a high bar when there's video evidence of your client orchestrating a hate crime. The meeting ended shortly after, with no resolution. As Martinson drove home, he thought about the Connor O'Brien text Jeremy had recovered. That might be their best shot, arguing that Ethan had intended only intimidation, not serious violence, that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. It was a weak argument, but it was all they had. Day 3 of the trial began with the prosecution calling Dylan Marchetti to the stand. Dylan was 19 now, having turned 18 shortly after the assault. He'd been tried as an adult, pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and ethnic intimidation, and was currently serving a 15-year sentence as part of his plea agreement. In exchange for his cooperation against Ethan, the prosecution had agreed not to seek additional charges. He looked different from the cocky teenager in the videos. His hair was cut short, prison regulation style. He'd lost weight. His eyes had the haunted look of someone who'd seen too much, done too much, and was drowning in the weight of his own conscience. After being sworn in, he sat in the witness chair looking small and young, nothing like the violent thug who'd swung a baseball bat at Marcus's face. Monica Reynolds approached gently. Dylan was her witness, but he was also a convicted criminal, which made him vulnerable on cross-examination. She needed to establish his credibility before Martinson could tear it apart. Dylan, you pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and ethnic intimidation in connection with the attack on Marcus Johnson. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. And you're currently serving a 15-year sentence? Yes, ma'am. Why did you decide to plead guilty? Dylan's voice was quiet. Because I did it. Because I hurt Marcus really badly and there was no excuse for it. Because I wanted to take responsibility for what I did. You're testifying today as part of your plea agreement. The prosecution agreed not to seek additional charges in exchange for your truthful testimony. Is that correct? Yes. So you understand that if you lie on this stand, that agreement is void and you could face additional charges? Yes. But I'm not going to lie. I'm done lying. Reynolds nodded, satisfied. Dylan, how long have you known Ethan Caldwell? Since middle school. We've been friends for like 6 years. Would you describe him as the leader of your friend group? Yeah, definitely. Ethan was always the one making plans, deciding what we'd do. The rest of us kind of followed his lead. Can you tell the jury about the planning that led to the assault on Marcus Johnson? Dylan took a deep breath and the story tumbled out. It had started, he said, back in sophomore year. Ethan had always resented the scholarship students at Lincoln Prep, felt like they were taking spots that should go to students whose families had paid full tuition for generations. But Marcus specifically bothered him because Marcus was smart, confident, popular with teachers. He didn't act subservient or grateful to be allowed into Lincoln's wealthy, predominantly white world. He acted like he belonged there. Ethan used to say Marcus was uppity, Dylan testified. He'd say we needed to remind him where he came from, that he was just there on charity. At first it was just words, talking shit, making jokes. But then it escalated. How did it escalate? We started messing with him. Knocking his books out of his hands, throwing food at him in the cafeteria, that kind of stuff. Ethan would come up with ideas and we'd execute them. It was like a game to him. Seeing how far we could push Marcus before he'd snap or quit school or something. Did Marcus ever fight back? Never. He'd just take it. Report it to teachers sometimes, but nothing ever happened. That just made Ethan angrier, actually. He'd say Marcus was a snitch, that he needed to be taught a lesson. When did the planning for the June 14th assault begin? Maybe 3 weeks before. Ethan came to us and said he was done playing around. Said it was time to really make Marcus understand he didn't belong. He laid out this whole plan, how we'd create a fake social media profile, pretend to be a girl Marcus liked, lure him to an isolated place. He made it sound like we were just going to scare him, rough him up a little. Did you believe that? That it would just be a scare? Dylan looked ashamed. I wanted to believe it. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't think it would go as far as it did. Walk the jury through what happened that night. Dylan's testimony matched what the video had shown, but hearing it described in his own words, with the context of planning and deliberation, made it somehow even worse. Ethan had purchased the baseball bats specifically for the attack. He'd scouted the warehouse location days in advance. He'd coordinated with Trevor's cousin to create the fake Instagram profile. Every detail had been carefully planned. When Marcus showed up, Ethan was excited, Dylan said. Like this was something he'd been looking forward to. We came out from where we'd been hiding and Marcus looked so confused. He didn't understand what was happening. Ethan started calling him slurs, telling him he didn't belong at our school, that we were going to teach him a lesson. What happened next? Marcus tried to leave. Trevor hit him with the chain, knocked him down. Then we just lost it. Me and Connor started hitting him with the bats. Ethan was standing there telling us where to hit, how hard. He was like a coach or a director. Get his face, he'd say. Break something so he remembers. He was controlling everything. Did Ethan personally strike Marcus? Dylan hesitated. I can't say for sure. It was chaotic and I was focused on what I was doing. But he was definitely participating, directing us, encouraging us. Even if his hands didn't touch Marcus, and I think they did, I think I saw him kicking Marcus when he was on the ground. He was responsible for all of it. It was his idea, his plan, his hate that made it happen. Reynolds let that statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing. At any point, did Ethan try to stop the assault? No, never. The only reason we stopped is because Marcus stopped moving and we got scared we'd killed him. That's when Ethan said we should go, that we'd done enough. One more question, Dylan. In the time you've had to reflect on what happened, what do you understand now that you didn't understand then? Dylan's eyes filled with tears. I understand that I nearly killed someone because of the color of his skin. I understand that I destroyed Marcus's life, took away his future, caused him pain that he'll carry forever. And I understand that no matter how sorry I am, no matter how much I wish I could take it back, I can't. That's something I have to live with every single day for the rest of my life. Thank you, Dylan. No further questions. The witness had been devastating. Several jurors were watching Ethan with undisguised contempt. The portrait Dylan had painted, of Ethan as the calculating, hate-filled ringleader, was damning. Martinson stood for cross-examination, knowing he had to undermine Dylan's credibility but walking a careful line. Go too hard, and the jury would sympathize with the remorseful young man who'd taken responsibility for his actions. Too soft, and Dylan's testimony would stand unchallenged. Mr. Marchetti, you testified that you're serving 15 years for your role in this assault, correct? Yes, sir. That's significantly less than the life sentence my client is facing, isn't it? I pleaded guilty. I took responsibility. You also agreed to testify against your former friend in exchange for that reduced sentence, didn't you? Yes, but... So you had a strong incentive to tell the prosecution what they wanted to hear, correct? I told the truth. Mr. Marchetti, isn't it true that you were the one who actually broke Marcus's arm? That you swung the bat that fractured his skull? Dylan's face crumpled. Yes, I did those things. I'm not denying what I did. But it's easier to focus blame on my client than to accept your own full responsibility, isn't it? No, sir. I accept what I did. But Ethan organized it. It was his hate that started all of this. Martinson pulled up the text messages Jeremy had recovered from Connor's phone. Mr. Marchetti, I'm showing you a text exchange between you and Connor O'Brien from June 12th. Can you read the highlighted portion? Dylan squinted at the screen. Dude, serious. Already bought the equipment. Says it's time someone taught that scholarship N-word his place. That's your text, correct? Yes. So you knew what Ethan was planning? Yes. And you participated willingly? Yes. I'm not saying I'm innocent. Earlier you testified that Ethan promised you just scare Marcus. But this text suggests you knew it was going to be violent. Which is it? Dylan struggled. He said we'd scare him. But I guess I knew it meant hurting him. I just didn't think it would get as bad as it did. Now please read Connor's response in this exchange. Man feels too far. What if he dies? And your response? He won't die. We're just gonna scare him. He promised nobody gets seriously hurt. Martinson turned to the jury. So according to this text message sent 2 days before the assault, Ethan specifically said nobody would get seriously hurt. Correct. That's what he said, but... Thank you. No further questions. It was a small victory. Martinson had established that Ethan had supposedly intended only intimidation, not attempted murder. It wasn't enough to create reasonable doubt about the assault itself, but it might help with sentencing if, when Ethan was convicted. The prosecution called several more witnesses over the next 2 days. Marcus's teachers testified about his academic excellence before the assault and his struggles afterward. A psychologist described the PTSD Marcus suffered from. Character witnesses painted a picture of a young man full of promise whose life had been derailed by racist violence. The defense had few witnesses to call. A forensic psychologist testified that Ethan showed no signs of being an inherent violent person, that the assault represented an anomaly in his otherwise law-abiding life. A Lincoln Prep administrator testified that Ethan had never been disciplined for racist behavior, carefully not mentioning that no students had ever been disciplined for racist behavior despite numerous complaints. Finally, on day 5 of the trial, it was Marcus's turn to testify. He moved slowly to the witness stand, his left arm still weak, his gait slightly off balance. He was sworn in and sat carefully, his mother watching from the gallery with her hands clasped in prayer. Reynolds approached gently. Marcus, thank you for being here today. I know this is difficult. I want to tell my story, Marcus said quietly. I want people to know what happened. Can you tell the jury about your experience at Lincoln Prep before the assault? Marcus took a deep breath and began. He described his excitement at being accepted to Lincoln on a full scholarship, his hopes for the opportunities it would provide. He described the first day of 9th grade, walking into that school and immediately feeling the weight of being different, being one of only a handful of black students in a sea of wealthy white faces. I thought if I worked hard, if I was friendly and respectful, people would accept me, he said. But Ethan made it clear from the first day that I wasn't welcome. He'd walk past me in the hall and say things under his breath. Scholarship N-word. Diversity hire. Affirmative action case. At first I tried to ignore it, but it never stopped. It only got worse. He detailed the escalating harassment, the racial slurs, the physical intimidation, the constant feeling of being watched and targeted. He described going to administrators and being dismissed, being told he was being too sensitive, that he needed to develop a thicker skin. I started to believe them, Marcus said. I started to think maybe it was my fault. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I should just keep my head down and accept that this was the price of the opportunities Lincoln offered. What happened on June 14th? I got a message on Instagram from a girl I'd noticed at a basketball game. Her name was Bree. She seemed interested, asked if I wanted to come to a party she was throwing. I was excited. I thought finally something good was happening, that maybe I was making connections with people who didn't see me as different. His voice became quieter. I went to the address she gave me. It was an old warehouse. I thought it was weird, but sometimes kids throw parties in abandoned places, right? I went inside looking for music, for people. And then Ethan stepped out of the shadows. What did he say to you? He said, "Hey Marcus, looking for something?" And I knew something was wrong. I tried to leave, but his friends were already blocking the exits. And then, he paused, fighting tears. And then Ethan told me this was my real welcome party. He said I'd been walking around Lincoln like I belonged there, like I was equal to them, and it was time someone reminded me what I really was. What happened next? They beat me. I tried to fight back at first, but there were 4 of them and they had weapons. I begged them to stop. I remember the pain, the feeling of my arm breaking, my ribs cracking. I remember Ethan's voice the whole time, telling them where to hit me, calling me slurs, laughing. And then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in the hospital and my mom was crying, and the doctors were telling me I'd almost died. Reynolds gave him a moment to compose himself. Several jurors were crying openly now. Marcus, how has this assault affected your life? I lost my scholarship to Temple. The brain injury makes it hard to concentrate for long periods, so I can't handle a full course load anymore. I have chronic pain from my ribs. My vision is permanently damaged. I have nightmares almost every night. I'm in therapy twice a week. I had to move to a different school because I couldn't face going back to Lincoln. I lost the future I'd been working toward my whole life. Thank you, Marcus. I have no further questions. Martinson approached for cross-examination, his manner respectful but probing. Marcus, I'm sorry for what happened to you. No one deserves what you went through. Marcus said nothing, just watched him warily. I want to ask you about your relationship with Ethan before June 14th. You testified that he harassed you, called you slurs, made you feel unwelcome. Is that correct? Yes. Did you ever respond to these provocations? I tried to ignore them. But you must have felt angry? Of course I felt angry. Did you ever express that anger on social media? Marcus frowned. What do you mean? Martinson pulled up screenshots on the courtroom display. I'm showing you posts from your Twitter account from approximately 2 years ago. Can you read this one? Marcus looked at the screen and his jaw tightened. That was a long time ago. Please read it for the jury. White people been stealing and killing for centuries and now they want to act like victims. And this one? Affirmative action isn't racism, it's payback. Did you write these posts? Yes, but... So you held negative views about white people generally? Reynolds stood. Objection, Your Honor. These posts from 2 years ago, when Marcus was 15 years old and processing experiences of racism, are not relevant to whether the defendant orchestrated a brutal assault. Your Honor, Martinson argued, these posts speak to the witness's credibility and to the claim that the defendant's actions were motivated solely by racial animus. If the animosity was mutual, that's relevant context. Judge Holloway considered. I'll allow limited questioning, but tread carefully, Mr. Martinson. This victim is not on trial. Martinson turned back to Marcus. These posts suggest you had hostile feelings toward white students. Is that fair to say? I had hostile feelings toward racism, Marcus said, his voice stronger now. There's a difference. I was 15, I was dealing with being called slurs every day and I was angry. That doesn't mean I deserve to be beaten nearly to death. Of course not. But it does suggest that the relationship between you and the defendant was more complicated than simple victimization, doesn't it? No, Marcus said firmly. It doesn't. I posted some angry tweets when I was 15. Ethan and his friends planned for weeks to lure me to an abandoned building and beat me with baseball bats while calling me racial slurs and filming it for entertainment. Those things are not equivalent. They're not even in the same universe. Martinson realized he was losing ground. The jury was looking at him with hostility, seeing this line of questioning as exactly what Reynolds had warned against, victim blaming. No further questions, he said, returning to his seat. Marcus stepped down from the witness stand and Reynolds stood. Your Honor, the people rest. The defense's case was brief. Beyond the forensic psychologist, they called a few character witnesses for Ethan. A youth soccer coach who testified that Ethan had always been a good kid, a family friend who described him as polite and well-mannered, a teacher who said he'd never shown signs of racism in her classroom. But these witnesses were undercut on cross-examination. The soccer coach admitted he'd never seen Ethan interact with students of color. The family friend acknowledged that the Caldwell family lived in an almost exclusively white neighborhood and socialized in almost exclusively white circles. The teacher conceded that Lincoln Prep's curriculum included almost no discussions of race or systemic inequality. Martinson had hoped to call Ethan to testify in his own defense, but after the disasters of the previous days, he'd advised strongly against it. Putting Ethan on the stand would allow Reynolds to cross-examine him about every racist text, every slur, every detail of the planning. And given Ethan's inability to show genuine remorse or accept responsibility, he would likely alienate the jury even further. Ethan had wanted to testify. He believed he could explain himself, make the jury understand that he hadn't meant for things to go so far. But his father had agreed with Martinson. It was too risky. So the defense rested without calling Ethan, which was his constitutional right but which also meant the jury would hear no explanation from him, no expression of remorse, nothing to counter the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The closing arguments took place on day 6. Reynolds went first, standing before the jury with the weight of the entire case behind her. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past week you've heard testimony and seen evidence that paints a clear, unambiguous picture. Ethan Caldwell orchestrated a brutal, racially motivated assault that nearly killed Marcus Johnson. This wasn't a spontaneous fight that got out of hand. This wasn't teenage boys being boys. This was a calculated hate crime, planned over weeks, executed with precision, and motivated by the defendant's belief that Marcus, because he was black, didn't belong at Lincoln Prep and needed to be violently reminded of his place. She walked along the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. The defense wants you to believe that Ethan was somehow less guilty because he might not have personally struck every blow. But the law is clear. If you plan a crime, if you organize it, if you direct others to carry it out, you are guilty of that crime. Ethan bought the weapons. Ethan chose the location. Ethan created the lure that brought Marcus to that warehouse. Ethan stood over Marcus's broken body directing his friends to get his face and break something so he remembers. Under the law, that makes him just as guilty, more guilty actually, than the young men who swung the bats. She paused, letting her words sink in. The defense also wants you to believe that maybe this was just a complicated teenage relationship, that maybe Marcus bore some responsibility because he posted some angry tweets when he was 15 years old. But think about what you saw in that video. Think about Marcus begging for mercy. Think about Ethan laughing while a human being lay bleeding at his feet. Does that look like a complicated relationship? Or does it look like exactly what it is? A hate crime. Reynolds returned to her table and picked up a photograph of Marcus before the assault. Smiling, healthy, full of life. This is who Marcus was before June 14th. An honors student with a scholarship to Temple University. A young man with dreams and ambitions. A son who made his mother proud. And this, she held up a photo of Marcus in the hospital, face swollen beyond recognition, is what Ethan Caldwell took from him. His health. His scholarship. His future. His sense of safety in the world. She set the photos down and faced the jury directly. Ethan Caldwell is guilty of aggravated assault. He is guilty of ethnic intimidation. He is guilty of conspiracy to commit assault causing serious bodily injury. The evidence proves this beyond any reasonable doubt. And when you deliberate, I ask you to remember Marcus's face as he begged for mercy. Remember Ethan's voice directing the violence. Remember that justice demands accountability. Find Ethan Caldwell guilty on all counts. Thank you. She sat down and Judge Holloway nodded to the defense table. Martinson stood, knowing he faced an uphill battle but determined to give his client the best defense possible. Ladies and gentlemen, no one is disputing that a terrible crime occurred on June 14th. No one is disputing that Marcus Johnson suffered horribly. The question before you is not whether a crime happened, but whether my client is guilty of the specific charges he faces. He paced slowly, gathering his thoughts. The prosecution has presented a narrative of my client as a calculating mastermind, a racist monster who planned every detail of this assault. But let me present you with an alternative narrative, one that's supported by the evidence they don't want you to focus on. My client is a 17-year-old boy who got caught up in something that spiraled out of control. Yes, he was present. Yes, he said terrible things. But being present at a crime and saying offensive things is not the same as being the primary perpetrator. Several jurors looked skeptical. Martinson pressed on. You heard testimony from Dylan Marchetti, who admitted under cross-examination that my client had specifically said nobody would get seriously hurt. You saw text messages showing that Ethan's intention was intimidation, not attempted murder. And when you watched that video, as horrible as it was, you did not see clear evidence of my client personally striking Marcus. You saw him present, you heard him saying awful things, but the actual physical violence was committed by Dylan Marchetti, Connor O'Brien, and Trevor Hastings. Now, the prosecution argues that planning and directing a crime makes you guilty of that crime. And that's legally true. But you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that my client planned and directed what actually occurred, not what he said he intended. There's a significant difference between planning to scare someone and planning to nearly beat them to death. The text messages show Ethan promised it wouldn't get serious. That's not a plan for attempted murder. That's a plan for intimidation that went catastrophically wrong when others exceeded what Ethan had intended. Martinson knew he was walking a fine line, trying to minimize Ethan's culpability without completely absolving him, which would seem dishonest given the evidence. Should my client have been there? No. Should he have participated in any way in intimidating Marcus? Absolutely not. Does he bear moral responsibility for what happened? To some degree, yes. But moral responsibility and legal guilt of these specific charges are different things. The prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Ethan Caldwell intended to cause the serious bodily harm that Marcus suffered. And the evidence shows that his stated intention was something far less serious, something that his co-defendants exceeded. He returned to stand directly in front of the jury box. I'm not asking you to find my client innocent of everything. I'm asking you to carefully consider whether the evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt that he's guilty of these specific charges. If you have doubt, reasonable doubt based on the evidence, about whether he intended the full extent of what occurred, then your duty under the law is to find him not guilty. You can believe he did wrong. You can believe he should face consequences. But if you have reasonable doubt about his guilt on these charges, you must acquit. Thank you. He sat down and Ethan gave him a slight nod. It wasn't a great closing, but given the circumstances, it was the best Martinson could do. Reynolds stood for rebuttal. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense just spent 10 minutes trying to convince you that Ethan Caldwell is somehow less guilty because things spiraled out of control. But let me remind you what you saw in that video. You saw Ethan directing the violence. Get his face. Break something so he remembers. Does that sound like someone who lost control? Or does it sound like someone who was getting exactly what he wanted? She let the question hang. The defense wants you to believe that Ethan only intended to scare Marcus. But you don't buy baseball bats if you just want to scare someone. You don't lure someone to an abandoned warehouse if you just want to intimidate them. You don't take videos of yourself urinating on an unconscious person if your intentions were somehow pure. Every single action Ethan took that night shows that he intended serious harm. And he got exactly what he intended. Reynolds picked up the evidence binder one final time. The defense says you need reasonable doubt to convict. I agree. But reasonable doubt is not any doubt. It's not the defense attorney's what-if scenarios. It's doubt based on reason and common sense. And when you apply reason and common sense to this evidence, to the planning, to the videos, to Dylan's testimony, to Marcus's injuries, there is no reasonable doubt. Ethan Caldwell is guilty. Hold him accountable. Thank you. Judge Holloway gave the jury their instructions, explaining the legal standards for each charge, the meaning of reasonable doubt, and their duty to consider only the evidence presented in court. Then, at 3:47 p.m. on the sixth day of trial, the jury was sent to deliberate. Ethan and his family retreated to a private conference room to wait. Martinson tried to prepare them for the likelihood of conviction, but Richard Caldwell remained stubbornly optimistic. You planted doubt, he insisted. The text showing Ethan said nobody would get seriously hurt. That's reasonable doubt right there. Maybe, Martinson said, though he didn't believe it. But I want you all to prepare for the possibility of conviction. If that happens, we'll appeal, but when the jury acquits, Richard interrupted, we're going to sue that Johnson family for defamation. They've destroyed my son's reputation, cost me millions in legal fees. Dad, Ethan said quietly, maybe we should just wait and see what happens. It was the first sensible thing Martinson had heard his client say in weeks. Marcus and his mother also waited in a different conference room. They said little, both lost in their own thoughts. Diane held her son's hand, praying silently. The media waited outside, cameras ready, reporters preparing both conviction and acquittal versions of their stories. And the jury deliberated. They took a preliminary vote immediately upon entering the deliberation room. 10 voted guilty on all counts. 2 voted not guilty, an older white man who felt the prosecution hadn't definitively proved Ethan had personally struck Marcus, and a middle-aged white woman who felt some sympathy for the argument that things had spiraled beyond Ethan's intentions. The foreperson, a black woman named Sandra Jenkins who worked as an accountant, organized the discussion systematically, going through each charge and each piece of evidence. Let's start with the video, she said. What does it show us? It shows Ethan directing the attack, said a younger Hispanic juror named Carlos. He's standing there telling them what to do like a coach. That's not someone who lost control. But he doesn't actually hit Marcus himself, the older white man Robert pointed out. Not clearly anyway. Does he need to? Another juror, an Asian woman named May, asked. If I hire someone to kill my husband, I'm guilty of murder even if I don't pull the trigger myself. Same principle here. They debated for hours, going through the text messages, Dylan's testimony, Marcus's injuries, the legal standard for conspiracy and ethnic intimidation. Slowly, methodically, Sandra guided them toward consensus. The holdout woman, Patricia, kept returning to the argument that Ethan had said nobody would get seriously hurt. But actions speak louder than words, Sandra argued. He bought baseball bats. He chose an isolated location with no witnesses. Those aren't the actions of someone planning mere intimidation. Maybe he was just being cautious, Patricia suggested. Maybe he bought the bats to scare Marcus, not to actually use them. Carlos leaned forward. I have a 15-year-old son. If he and his friends were planning to just scare someone, you know what they'd do? They'd jump out and yell, boo. They wouldn't spend weeks planning, buying weapons, creating fake social media profiles. That level of planning shows serious intent to cause harm. Robert remained concerned about the lack of evidence showing Ethan personally striking Marcus. The video doesn't clearly show him hitting the victim. Dylan testified he couldn't say for certain whether Ethan hit Marcus. How can we convict him of assault if we can't prove he assaulted anyone? May pulled out the jury instructions Judge Holloway had provided. It says here that under the law of conspiracy, all co-conspirators are equally guilty of the substantive crime if they planned it together and took steps to carry it out. So even if Ethan didn't swing the bat, if he planned the assault and brought the others there to do it, he's legally guilty of assault. But that seems unfair, Robert protested. The law doesn't care about fair, Sandra said gently. It cares about what's legal and what's not. And the law clearly states that if you plan a crime and facilitate it, you're guilty of that crime. They broke for dinner, eating sandwiches brought in by the court staff, and reconvened for evening deliberations. The discussion continued, circling the same arguments, but gradually the holdouts were coming around. Patricia finally spoke the words she'd been avoiding. I guess I just don't want to believe that a 17-year-old boy from a good family could be capable of such hatred. It's easier to believe he made a mistake than to accept that he's actually a racist who wanted to destroy another person's life. Sandra looked at her with compassion. I understand. But our job isn't to decide what we want to believe. It's to decide what the evidence proves. And the evidence proves that this particular 17-year-old boy, regardless of his family or his opportunities, orchestrated a hate crime. At 9:15 p.m., after more than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury took another vote. This time it was unanimous, guilty on all counts. They informed the bailiff they'd reached a verdict. Judge Holloway was notified. The attorneys were called back to the courthouse. The families were summoned from their hotels and holding rooms. By 10 p.m., everyone had reassembled in Courtroom 7B. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Journalists filled the gallery, their phones ready to live tweet the verdict. Protesters still gathered outside, their chants audible even through the courthouse's thick walls. Ethan sat at the defense table looking pale, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His mother was crying softly. His father's expression was stony. Marcus sat with his mother, both of them holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. Judge Holloway entered and everyone rose. When she was seated, she addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I understand you've reached a verdict? Sandra Jenkins stood. Yes, Your Honor. Please hand the verdict form to the bailiff. The bailiff walked the form from the jury box to the judge. Judge Holloway reviewed it, her expression revealing nothing. Then she handed it to the court clerk. The clerk will read the verdict. The clerk, an older woman who'd worked at the courthouse for 30 years and had seen everything, stood and unfolded the paper. Her voice was clear and steady. In the matter of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Ethan James Caldwell, case number CR 2024-8675, we the jury find the defendant, Ethan James Caldwell, on the charge of aggravated assault, guilty. Diane Johnson gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Marcus closed his eyes, a single tear sliding down his cheek. Patricia Caldwell's quiet crying became audible sobs. On the charge of ethnic intimidation, we find the defendant guilty. Ethan's face had gone completely white. His hands were shaking. On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault causing serious bodily injury, we find the defendant guilty. The clerk sat down. Judge Holloway looked at the defense table. Mr. Caldwell, please stand. Ethan stood, his legs visibly unsteady. Martinson stood beside him, one hand on his client's shoulder. The jury has found you guilty on all counts, Judge Holloway said, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. You will be remanded into custody immediately pending sentencing. Sentencing is scheduled for 6 weeks from today. Bailiff, please take the defendant into custody. 2 bailiffs approached the defense table. One of them pulled out handcuffs. No, Patricia Caldwell moaned. Please no. Richard Caldwell stood abruptly. Your Honor, my son has been free on bail throughout this trial. Surely he can remain free until sentencing. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Holloway interrupted, her tone brooking no argument, your son has been convicted of violent felonies. He will be held without bail until sentencing. Bailiff, proceed. The bailiff moved behind Ethan and pulled his arms behind his back. The click of the handcuffs seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. Mom, Ethan said, his voice cracking, finally showing emotion. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Whether he was sorry for what he'd done to Marcus or sorry for getting caught remained unclear. The bailiffs led him toward the side door that led to the holding cells. Patricia tried to follow, but another bailiff gently stopped her. Richard stood frozen, watching his son being led away in handcuffs, the reality of the situation finally penetrating his denial. On the other side of the courtroom, Marcus buried his face in his mother's shoulder and wept, not tears of joy because justice couldn't give him back what he'd lost, but tears of relief that the truth had been acknowledged, that his suffering had been validated, that Ethan would face consequences. Reynolds shook Marcus's hand, then his mother's. You did so well, she told him. You were brave and strong and you got justice. Thank you, Diane said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for believing us. For fighting for my son. Outside, the verdict spread through the crowd of protesters like wildfire. Those supporting Marcus cheered and hugged each other. Those supporting Ethan stood in stunned silence, some arguing that the verdict was unjust, others quietly slipping away into the night. The news broke on social media immediately. Within minutes, #EthanCaldwellGuilty was trending. News outlets updated their live blogs. Commentators began offering hot takes about what the verdict meant for issues of race, privilege, and justice in America. But inside the courthouse, in the quiet moments after the crowds had dispersed and the journalists had filed their stories, Monica Reynolds sat alone in her office reviewing the case file one more time. She'd won. Justice had been served. But she felt no triumphant satisfaction, only a weary sadness that this case had been necessary at all. 6 weeks later, the courtroom reconvened for sentencing. Ethan looked different now. 6 weeks in county jail had changed him. His expensive haircut had grown out. He'd lost weight. The cockiness that had characterized his bearing at trial was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. Judge Holloway had reviewed the pre-sentencing reports, the victim impact statements, and the sentencing recommendations from both sides. The prosecution sought the maximum, life in prison with a possibility of parole after 40 years. The defense pleaded for leniency, arguing that Ethan was still a minor at the time of the crime, that he had no prior record, that there was potential for rehabilitation. Before I impose sentence, Judge Holloway said, I'll hear from the victim. Mr. Johnson, would you like to make a statement? Marcus stood slowly, walking to the podium position between the defense and prosecution tables. He prepared a statement, written and rewritten it dozens of times, trying to find words adequate to express what had been taken from him. Your Honor, he began, his voice stronger than it had been at trial, I want to start by saying that I don't hate Ethan Caldwell. I've spent a lot of time in therapy trying not to hate him, because hate would only poison me further. But I do want him to understand what he took from me. He turned slightly, looking directly at Ethan for the first time since the verdict. I was supposed to start at Temple University this fall. I had a full scholarship. I was going to study engineering. I was going to be the first person in my family to graduate from college. That's gone now. The brain injury makes it impossible for me to handle a full course load. I get headaches if I read for too long. I can't concentrate the way I used to. Temple withdrew the scholarship. They had to because I can't meet the academic requirements anymore. His voice cracked slightly, but he continued. I lost my vision in my left eye. I have chronic pain from my ribs. I have nightmares every single night where I'm back in that warehouse, feeling the bats hitting me, hearing your voice telling your friends to break me. I wake up screaming. I'm in therapy 3 times a week, and my therapist says I might have PTSD for the rest of my life. Ethan was crying now, his shoulders shaking. But you know what the worst part is? It's not the physical pain. It's not even the lost opportunities. It's the loss of safety. I can't walk down the street without looking over my shoulder. I can't be around groups of white men without panicking. You didn't just hurt my body. You killed the person I was. The confident, hopeful kid who believed that if he worked hard and did the right things he could succeed. That person is dead. And I have to figure out how to build a new person from what's left. He paused, gathering himself. I don't know what the right sentence is for what you did to me. No amount of years in prison will give me back what I lost. But I hope that wherever you are, whatever happens to you, you spend every single day thinking about what you did. Not because I want you to suffer, I don't. But because I want you to truly understand the weight of racial hatred. I want you to understand that I wasn't just some target, some symbol. I was a human being with dreams and a future, and you tried to destroy that because you couldn't accept that a black person belonged in your world. He turned back to Judge Holloway. Thank you for listening, Your Honor. He returned to his seat, and Diane wrapped her arms around him, whispering prayers and encouragements. Judge Holloway looked at Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, do you wish to make a statement before I impose sentence? Martinson leaned close to Ethan, whispering urgently. After a moment, Ethan stood. Your Honor, I want to say I'm sorry. To Marcus, to his family, to everyone hurt by what happened. His voice was barely audible. I know I can't take it back. I know sorry doesn't fix anything. But I am sorry. I was angry and stupid, and I let that anger turn into something evil. I wish I could go back and stop myself, but I can't. All I can do is say that I understand now, I understand what I did and how wrong it was, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it somehow. He sat down quickly as if his legs couldn't hold him anymore. Judge Holloway was silent for a long moment, reviewing her notes. Then she spoke, and her voice carried the full authority of the law. Ethan Caldwell, you were convicted by a jury of your peers of aggravated assault, ethnic intimidation, and conspiracy to commit assault causing serious bodily injury. These are serious crimes, made more serious by the racial animus that motivated them. You didn't simply assault Marcus Johnson in a moment of anger or poor judgment. You planned for weeks to lure him to an isolated location and orchestrate a brutal attack designed to terrorize him and send a message to all black students that they were unwelcome in your school. She paused, making sure Ethan was looking at her. Your attorney has argued for leniency based on your age and lack of prior record. And those are factors I must consider under the law. You were 17 at the time of these crimes. Your brain, like all teenage brains, was not fully developed. You have the capacity for change and rehabilitation. But I must balance that against the severity of your crimes and the need to protect society and deter others from similar conduct. Another pause. This court has reviewed extensive pre-sentencing materials, including psychological evaluations, letters from family and friends, and your academic records. And while these materials paint a picture of a young man with potential, they cannot erase what you did to Marcus Johnson. You nearly killed him. You destroyed his future. And you did it out of racial hatred, which strikes at the very foundation of our democratic society. Judge Holloway opened her sentencing folder. On the charge of aggravated assault, I sentence you to 15 to 30 years in state prison. On the charge of ethnic intimidation, I sentence you to 7 to 14 years in state prison. On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault causing serious bodily injury, I sentence you to 10 to 20 years in state prison. These sentences will run concurrently, meaning you will serve a total of 15 to 30 years, with the possibility of parole after 15 years if you demonstrate genuine rehabilitation. Patricia Caldwell sobbed loudly. Richard sat stone-faced, his world crumbling around him. Additionally, Judge Holloway continued, you will be required to pay restitution to Marcus Johnson in the amount of $250,000 for medical expenses, lost scholarship opportunities, and pain and suffering. You will be prohibited from contacting Marcus Johnson or any member of his family for the rest of your life. And when you are eventually released, if you are released, you will be required to complete 1,000 hours of community service working on racial justice initiatives. She looked at Ethan one final time. Mr. Caldwell, I hope you use your time in prison to truly reflect on what brought you to this point. I hope you examine the privilege and prejudice that allowed you to see another human being as less than you, as deserving of violence and degradation. I hope you emerge from prison a different person than the one who entered. But whether you change or not, you will serve this sentence. Bailiff, remand the defendant. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo forever. Ethan was led away in handcuffs for the second and final time. His mother screamed his name. His father finally broke, tears streaming down his face. Marcus sat quietly, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow. No sentence could give him back what he'd lost. The courtroom emptied slowly. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Protesters outside reacted with mixed emotions, some celebrating the stiff sentence, others insisting it wasn't enough, a few still claiming Ethan had been railroaded. Monica Reynolds found Marcus in the hallway and shook his hand one final time. "You did it," she said. "You survived, you testified, you got justice. What happens now is up to you. You get to decide who you become after this." "I don't know who that is yet," Marcus admitted. "That's okay. You have time to figure it out." As Marcus and his mother left the courthouse, stepping into the bright afternoon sunlight, reporters surrounded them with microphones and cameras and shouted questions. Diane raised her hand for quiet. "My son has been through enough," she said firmly. "We're grateful for the jury's verdict and the judge's sentence. We're grateful to Ms. Reynolds and everyone who fought for justice. Now we ask for privacy as Marcus continues his healing. Thank you." They pushed through the crowd to their car. As they drove away from the courthouse, away from the cameras and the chaos, Marcus looked out the window at the city he'd once loved, the place where he'd dreamed of building his future. Those dreams were gone now. But maybe, somehow, he could build new ones. The story should have ended there. Justice served, sentence imposed, all parties moving forward with their lives as best they could. But there was one detail, one seemingly insignificant element that had been present throughout the entire trial, that no one had noticed or questioned. And when it finally came to light 3 days after the sentencing, it would blow the case wide open and reveal a truth so shocking that even the most cynical observers would be left stunned. It started with a phone call. Monica Reynolds was in her office, already deep into her next case, when her cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer. Monica Reynolds. "Ms. Reynolds, my name is Jordan Webb. I'm a junior at Lincoln Prep, and I need to talk to you about the Ethan Caldwell case." Reynolds sat up straighter. "Jordan, the trial is over. Ethan has been sentenced. If you have information, you should have come forward earlier." "I know, and I'm sorry. But I was scared. I'm still scared. But I can't stay silent anymore. There's something about that night, about the attack, that didn't come out at trial. Something Ethan's hiding. Something that makes everything even worse than anyone realizes." "What are you talking about? Can we meet? In person? I have evidence, but I need to show you. I need to know you'll protect me." Reynolds's investigative instincts, honed over years of prosecuting criminals, were tingling. "Meet me at my office in 1 hour. Don't talk to anyone else about this." "I won't." "Thank you, Ms. Reynolds." The line went dead. 63 minutes later, a slight teenager with dark curly hair and anxious eyes sat in Reynolds's office, a laptop bag clutched in their lap. "Thank you for seeing me," Jordan said. "I know this is probably nothing, and I'm sorry for wasting your time, but just tell me what you know." Jordan took a deep breath. "I was friends with Marcus. Not super close, but we had classes together, ate lunch together sometimes. And I was at school the day after the attack, when everyone was finding out what happened. The administration called an assembly to address it, and Ethan's friends were all acting weird. Dylan had already been arrested, but Connor and Trevor were there, and they were whispering to each other, looking nervous." "Okay. What does this have to do with anything?" "That's when I noticed it. I don't know why it stuck with me, but it did. Connor was wearing these bright yellow shoelaces in his sneakers. Really distinctive, neon yellow. I'd never seen him wear them before. And then, after all of them got arrested, after I saw the videos on the news, I couldn't stop thinking about those shoelaces." Reynolds frowned. "I'm not following." Jordan opened their laptop. "So I started digging. Nothing criminal, just public social media, yearbook photos, stuff like that. And I noticed that in every photo of Ethan from the past 2 years, going back to sophomore year, he's wearing the same shoes. Nike Air Jordans, black with red accents. His signature shoes. Everyone knew they were his thing." "Jordan." "Wait, just let me show you." Jordan pulled up a series of photos. Ethan at basketball games, at school events, at parties, always wearing the same distinctive sneakers. "Now look at this." Jordan pulled up a news photo from the day after the assault, showing Connor and Trevor being led into the police station. "See Connor's shoes?" Reynolds leaned closer. Connor was wearing Nike Air Jordans, black with red accents. The same shoes Ethan always wore. "So they have similar taste in shoes," Reynolds said. "That's not evidence of anything." "That's what I thought at first. But then I remembered the yellow shoelaces. So I went back and looked at photos from before the attack." Jordan pulled up another series of images. "This is from a party 3 weeks before the assault. Look at Connor's shoes." In the photo, Connor was wearing completely different sneakers. Adidas, white with blue stripes. And this is from a basketball game 2 weeks before the assault. Another photo. Connor in different shoes again. So Connor changed his shoes. Reynolds said, though her interest was piqued now. People do that. But here's the thing, I got curious about why Connor would suddenly start wearing the exact same shoes as Ethan, so I started looking at the inventory from the evidence log. It's public record, right? I pulled up the list of items seized from each defendant. Jordan pulled up a document on the laptop. Look at what was taken from Ethan's house during the search warrant execution. Reynolds scanned the list. Clothing, electronics, school materials, and there, near the bottom, one pair Nike Air Jordan sneakers, black with red accents, size 11. Now look at what was seized from Connor's house. Reynolds looked. No sneakers listed. The police took Ethan's signature shoes as evidence but not Connor's? That seemed weird. So I filed a Freedom of Information request for the forensic reports on the shoes seized from Ethan. And look what I found. Jordan pulled up a heavily redacted forensic report. But one detail was clearly visible. The shoes seized from Ethan's house contained no traces of blood, dirt, or any other evidence suggesting they'd been worn at the crime scene. Reynolds's mind was racing now. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Ethan gave his shoes to Connor right before or right after the attack. That the shoes Connor was wearing when he was arrested, the ones that look like Ethan's signature shoes, actually were Ethan's shoes. And that Connor gave Ethan his shoes in exchange, which is why Connor suddenly showed up to school the next day wearing those bright yellow shoelaces and shoes that weren't his style. But why would they swap shoes? That's what I've been trying to figure out. And then I remembered something from the video. You showed it in court. I wasn't there, but I saw clips on the news. There's a moment where the camera angle is low, catching everyone's feet. Can you pull up that video? Reynolds hesitated. Jordan, this is an official investigation. I can't just show you evidence. Please. I think this matters. I think there's something everyone missed. Against her better judgment, Reynolds pulled up the trial exhibit video on her computer. She found the moment Jordan was describing. About 4 minutes into the assault, the phone camera had been dropped or positioned low, catching a ground-level view. There, Jordan said, pointing. Freeze it right there. Reynolds paused the video. The image was chaotic. Feet moving, someone falling, blood on the concrete floor. But there, clearly visible in the frame, was a pair of black sneakers with red accents. Those are the shoes, Jordan said. The ones everyone thought were Ethan's. But look closer at the shoelaces. Reynolds zoomed in on the image. The laces were dirty, worn, and bright yellow. Oh my God, Reynolds breathed. Those aren't Ethan's shoes, Jordan said. Those are Connor's shoes, the ones Connor was arrested in, the ones that looked like Ethan's. But in this video taken during the attack, they have Connor's yellow shoelaces. Which means Connor was wearing his own shoes during the attack, not Ethan's, Reynolds finished. And sometime between the attack and the arrest they swapped. Right. And if you look at the rest of the video, Jordan fast-forwarded through the footage. Every time you can see those black and red shoes with yellow laces, they're connected to feet that are actively kicking Marcus. Not just standing there. Actually participating in the violence. Reynolds watched, her stomach sinking. The person wearing those shoes, the shoes everyone had assumed were Ethan's signature sneakers, was indeed actively involved in the beating. Kicking Marcus in the ribs. Stomping on his arm. While Ethan's voice directed the action, these feet were doing significant damage. Now watch this part, Jordan said, finding another section of video. This is about 6 minutes in, right near the end. The footage showed Marcus lying motionless on the ground, blood pooling around him. The person wearing the black and red shoes with yellow laces walked up close to Marcus's head. There was a pause as if the person was aiming. Then a vicious kick directly to Marcus's face. The sound was sickening, the crunch of bone, Marcus's gurgling cry. That's the kick that broke his orbital socket, Jordan said quietly. The one that destroyed his vision. Everyone thought it was Dylan with the baseball bat, but look, you can see Dylan in the background. He's the one filming this angle. That kick came from whoever was wearing those shoes. Reynolds sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. So Connor was more actively involved in the violence than anyone realized. That's important for his trial, but Ethan's already been sentenced. Ms. Reynolds, I don't think you understand what I'm saying. Jordan's voice was intense now. Connor and Ethan didn't just swap shoes randomly. They swapped shoes for a reason. And I think I know what that reason is. What? Look at this. Jordan pulled up another photo, a yearbook picture from sophomore year showing the entire basketball team. That's Connor, number 24. That's Trevor, number 15. That's Dylan, number 8. And that's Ethan, number 32. Reynolds looked at the photo. So, Now look at their shoe sizes. Jordan pulled up another document, medical records from the school nurse's office, obtained through another FOIA request. Connor wears size 10. Trevor wears size 11. Dylan wears size 9. And Ethan wears size 12. I'm still not following. The shoes seized from Ethan's house, the ones in the evidence log, were listed as size 11. Not size 12. Those weren't Ethan's shoes. Those were shoes that fit Connor, that Ethan had purchased specifically to give to Connor. And Connor's actual shoes, the ones with the yellow laces that he wore during the attack, weren't taken as evidence because when the police searched Connor's house, those shoes weren't there. They were at Ethan's house. The pieces were starting to come together in Reynolds's mind, forming a picture that was somehow even more disturbing than what had come out at trial. You're saying Ethan planned the shoe swap in advance? I'm saying Ethan planned everything in advance, including setting up Connor to take the fall for the most violent acts. Think about it. Connor was wearing shoes that looked like Ethan's signature shoes, shoes that everyone associated with Ethan. So when the video showed those shoes kicking Marcus in the face, everyone would assume it was Ethan doing it. Ethan could claim he didn't personally assault Marcus, that he just directed the others, and the video would seem to support that because the feet doing the kicking were wearing his shoes. Meanwhile, the actual shoes Ethan wore during the attack, shoes that might have Marcus's blood on them, DNA evidence, whatever, those shoes disappeared. Reynolds felt cold. But that would mean Ethan was even more calculating than anyone realized. That he set up his own friends to take the fall. That he planned from the beginning to have plausible deniability about his direct participation. And most importantly, Jordan leaned forward. It means we need to find Ethan's actual shoes from that night. Because I think if we do, we're going to find evidence that Ethan's direct participation in the violence was way more extensive than he admitted. Reynolds was already reaching for her phone. I need to call the lead detective. We need to execute another search warrant on the Caldwell home immediately. There's one more thing, Jordan said. I've been thinking about where those shoes might be and I remembered something. After the arrest, there was a charity drive at school. The Caldwell family donated a bunch of items, clothes, shoes, sports equipment, to a homeless shelter in Kensington. It was a big PR thing, them trying to show they were good people despite what their son did. Do you know which shelter? Hope Harbor Mission on Kensington Avenue. I volunteer there sometimes. I could ask around, see if any Nike Air Jordans in size 12 came through around that time. Reynolds was already dialing. Don't do anything. Don't talk to anyone. Let me handle this officially. But even as she said it, she knew this was going to be complicated. Ethan had already been sentenced. His conviction was final. Even if they found evidence of additional participation, even if they proved he'd deliberately hidden evidence and set up his co-defendants, what could they actually do legally? He'd already been convicted of the top charges. There were no more serious charges to file. Unless Reynolds thought back through the evidence, through the timeline, through everything they knew about that night. And suddenly a possibility occurred to her, one that made her blood run cold. What if the person who kicked Marcus in the face, destroying his vision, wasn't Connor at all? What if, despite the shoe swap designed to create confusion, it had actually been Ethan wearing Connor's shoes, participating directly in the violence in a way that could be proven? What if everything they thought they knew about that night was based on a deliberate deception? She needed those shoes. And she needed them now. 2 hours later, Detective Sarah Chin, who'd been the lead investigator on the case, sat in Reynolds' office reviewing Jordan's evidence. Chin was a veteran detective with 23 years on the force, and she'd seen plenty of criminals try to cover their tracks. But this level of premeditation from a 17-year-old was unusual. The kid makes a good case, Chin admitted. But we've got a problem. We already executed a search warrant on the Caldwell home. We can't just go back for a second bite at the apple without new probable cause. A teenager's theory about shoe swaps isn't going to convince a judge to issue another warrant. What about the charity donation angle? Reynolds asked. If we can prove the Caldwells donated shoes matching Ethan's size right after the attack, that's evidence of consciousness of guilt. That might be enough. Chin nodded slowly. Maybe. Let me make some calls. She reached out to the shelter, identifying herself as a detective investigating a criminal matter. The shelter's director was cooperative but not particularly organized. Their donation records from 6 months ago were incomplete. They remembered the Caldwell donation. It had been large, maybe 30 boxes of items, but they couldn't say specifically what had been included. Most of it went out to clients right away, the director explained. We don't keep long-term inventory of shoes and clothes. People need them immediately. Is there any way to track what specific items were donated and where they went? Not really. We don't have the resources for that kind of tracking. I'm sorry, detective. Dead end. Or was it? Reynolds had another idea. What about security footage? Do you have cameras that would have captured the donation being dropped off? We do, actually. The footage rolls over every 90 days, but this was just over 3 months ago. We might still have it. Can you preserve that footage? We'll get a warrant to review it. Sure, I can do that. Chin hung up and looked at Reynolds. Alright, so maybe we can prove shoes were donated. But even if we find them, even if they have Marcus's blood on them, what does that get us? Ethan's already serving 15 to 30 for aggravated assault. We can't charge him twice for the same crime. No, Reynolds agreed. But we might be able to charge him with additional crimes. Tampering with evidence. Obstruction of justice. Witness intimidation if we can prove he pressured Connor to go along with the shoe swap. Those charges could add years to his sentence. Might be worth pursuing, Chin said. Let me start the warrant process. While Chin worked on the legal mechanics, Reynolds called Jordan back. I need you to think very carefully about this, she said. If we pursue this, if it goes to trial again, you're going to be a witness. You're going to be subject to cross-examination. Ethan's defense attorney is going to come after you hard, try to discredit you, make you look like you're just seeking attention or making up theories. Are you prepared for that? Jordan was quiet for a moment. Ms. Reynolds, I've been thinking about Marcus every day since the attack. We weren't super close, but we were friends. And seeing what happened to him, seeing how scared all the black and brown kids at Lincoln are now, seeing how the school administration tried to cover it up and protect the Caldwell's reputation. Yeah, I'm prepared. Someone needs to stand up for what's right. Okay. Don't talk to anyone else about this. If reporters reach out, don't comment. If anyone from the defense contacts you, refer them to my office. Understood. Understood. Reynolds ended the call and sat back, thinking through the implications. This case had already been a media sensation. Reopening it with new evidence would create another firestorm. But if Jordan was right, if Ethan had orchestrated this elaborate deception to minimize his culpability, the public deserved to know. Marcus deserved to know. The warrant for the shelter's security footage was approved the next morning. Chen and Reynolds reviewed it together, fast-forwarding through hours of mundane footage until they found what they were looking for. Richard Caldwell pulling up in his BMW on a Tuesday afternoon, for days after Ethan's arrest. He unloaded box after box, carrying them into the shelter with the help of 2 young men who appeared to be employees or volunteers. Can we get a better angle on the boxes? Chen asked the tech who was assisting them. The tech zoomed in on several frames. Most of the boxes were standard moving boxes, sealed with tape. But one smaller box, carried by Richard Caldwell himself, was partially open at the top. And visible inside, carefully arranged on top of other items, was a pair of sneakers. Enhance that if you can, Reynolds said. The tech did his best, but the resolution wasn't great. The sneakers appeared to be black with red accents. They could have been Nike Air Jordans. They could have been any number of similar shoes. Not enough for a warrant, Chin said. No, Reynolds agreed. But it's suggestive. Keep watching. They continued through the footage. Richard Caldwell spent about 20 minutes inside the shelter. When he emerged, he was empty-handed, but he paused at his car to make a phone call. The camera caught his profile, his expression serious, almost worried. I wish we could hear that conversation, Chin muttered. Me too. But let's think about this strategically. We can't get the shoes back. They're long gone, probably being worn by someone in Kensington right now. So what can we actually prove? Chin pulled out her case notes. We can prove Connor was wearing shoes that looked like Ethan's during the arrest. We can prove those shoes were size 11, not Ethan's actual size. We can prove Ethan donated items to charity shortly after his arrest. We can probably prove, through more investigation, that Ethan purchased the shoes Connor was wearing, even though they weren't Ethan's size. Which suggests premeditation to create false evidence, Reynolds said. That could support additional charges. But we need more. We need someone to flip. Connor or Trevor. Someone who can testify about the shoe swap directly. Connor's trial is scheduled for next month, Chin said. What if we approach his attorney, offer a better deal in exchange for testimony about the shoe swap? His attorney is going to want to know what we're offering. We could offer to recommend a reduced sentence. He's looking at 25 to 40 years if convicted on all charges. We could offer 15 to 20 if he cooperates fully. Reynolds considered this. Connor had been silent throughout Ethan's trial, refusing to take any plea deal that required him to testify against his friend. But that was before he knew Ethan had set him up, had deliberately made Connor's participation look more extensive than it was to protect himself. Let's approach Connor's attorney, Reynolds decided. Show him what we've found. See if it changes Connor's willingness to cooperate. Connor O'Brien sat in the county jail interview room wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his diminished frame. 6 months of incarceration had changed him. His swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed wariness. His attorney, a public defender named Rachel Torres, sat beside him, her expression neutral. Across the table sat Reynolds and Chin with a laptop and several folders of evidence. Connor, thank you for agreeing to meet with us, Reynolds began. My attorney said I should hear what you have to say. Doesn't mean I'm talking. That's fair. We're here to show you some information that's come to light since Ethan's trial. Information that we think you'll find interesting. Reynolds opened the laptop and pulled up the series of photos Jordan had compiled. These are photos of you taken at various times in the 6 months before the attack on Marcus Johnson. Can you confirm these are you? Connor glanced at the images. Yeah, that's me. Can you identify what shoes you're wearing in each photo? Connor looked more carefully. Different shoes. White Adidas. Some Reeboks. These black Nikes. Now look at this photo. Reynolds pulled up the news image from the day after the attack. What shoes are you wearing here? Connor stared at the image for a long moment. Those look like Ethan's shoes. Do you remember where you got those shoes? Connor's jaw tightened. He looked at his attorney, who nodded slightly. Ethan gave them to me. Right before the arrest. Reynolds kept her expression neutral. Can you explain the circumstances? After that night, after we left Marcus at the warehouse, we went to the diner. We were there for maybe an hour and then the cops showed up. After they took us to the station, after they questioned us and let us call our parents, Ethan's dad got all of us released on bail super quick. Rich people, bail bondsmen, fancy lawyers, the whole thing. We all went to Ethan's house. This was like 5 in the morning, and Ethan pulled me aside. He said the cops were going to be looking at everything, going through all our stuff, and we needed to be smart. What did he mean by that? Connor's hands were shaking now. He said they'd be looking at shoe prints, at forensic evidence. He said my shoes probably had Marcus's blood on them and I should get rid of them. He offered me his shoes, said they were clean, said I should wear them home and throw my shoes away. He said his dad knew a place that incinerated trash, that nothing would ever be found. And did you do that? Did you give Ethan your shoes and take his? Connor nodded slowly. Yeah, I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I thought he was trying to help me. What happened to your actual shoes? The ones you wore during the attack. I gave them to Ethan. I never saw them again. I assumed he destroyed them like he said. Reynolds pulled up the warehouse video, the frame showing the black and red shoes with yellow laces kicking Marcus in the face. Connor, whose feet are these? Connor stared at the image. His face went pale. Those are my shoes. My yellow laces. But what? I thought those were Ethan's shoes in the video. Everyone said those were Ethan's shoes, his signature shoes. That's why it looked like Ethan was participating more than he admitted. But those are my shoes. My actual shoes from that night. Reynolds let that sink in. Connor, do you understand what Ethan did? He gave you his signature shoes to wear during the arrest, knowing everyone would associate those shoes with him. That way, when the video showed shoes that looked like his participating in the violence, he could claim he was just standing aside, directing things. But the shoes actually doing the kicking, your shoes, those looked enough like his that no one questioned it. He used you as a patsy. Connor's hands clenched into fists. That son of a bitch. Rachel Torres leaned forward. What exactly are you offering my client in exchange for testimony about this? We're preparing charges against Ethan for tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. If Connor testifies truthfully about the shoe swap and about Ethan's participation in the attack, we'll recommend a sentence of 12 to 15 years instead of the 25 to 40 he's currently facing. He'll also be eligible for parole after 8 years with good behavior. Torres looked at her client. That's a significant reduction, Connor. You're looking at potentially spending most of your adult life in prison if convicted on the current charges. This deal would have you out while you're still in your 20s. But I'd have to testify against Ethan. Ethan set you up, Reynolds said bluntly. He used you to protect himself. He destroyed evidence that might have exonerated you to some degree. He prioritized saving his own skin over any loyalty to his friends. Why do you owe him anything? Connor sat in silence for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. What do you need to know? Over the next 2 hours, Connor walked them through the entire night, but with crucial details that hadn't come out in Ethan's trial. He confirmed that Ethan had purchased the baseball bats specifically for the attack, that Ethan had scouted the warehouse location multiple times, that Ethan had coordinated every detail of the fake social media profile used to lure Marcus. But more importantly, he revealed Ethan's actual level of physical participation. Ethan said he wasn't going to hit Marcus himself, Connor explained. He said he'd direct things but stay clean, so if anything went wrong he could claim he tried to stop it. But once we got started, once Marcus was on the ground, Ethan got caught up in it. He was kicking Marcus in the ribs in the back. He grabbed the bat from Dylan at one point and hit Marcus in the shoulder. He was way more involved than he ever admitted. Why didn't you say this during Ethan's trial? Chin asked. Because Ethan's dad got to me. He came to visit me in jail, said his lawyers would make sure I went down for everything if I testified against Ethan. Said the Caldwell family would destroy me and my family. Said they had connections, could make sure I got the maximum sentence, could make sure my mom lost her job. I was scared. Reynolds made notes. We'll need you to testify about those threats too. That's witness intimidation, which is another charge we can file. Will you protect my family? Connor asked. If I do this, if I testify, will you make sure the Caldwells can't retaliate? We'll do everything we can, Reynolds promised. But I'm not going to lie to you, the Caldwells have money and influence. We'll request protective orders, we'll document any threats or retaliation attempts, but I can't guarantee they won't try something. Connor looked at his attorney again. She nodded. I think the risk is worth it, given what you're facing otherwise. Okay, Connor said finally. I'll do it. I'll testify. I'll tell everything I know. Reynolds felt a surge of satisfaction. This was the break they needed. With Connor's testimony, they could prove not just that Ethan had tampered with evidence, but that he had lied under oath about his level of participation, that he had intimidated witnesses, that his entire defense had been built on deception and manipulation. We'll need a formal proffer session where you detail everything in writing, Reynolds said. And then we'll go back to court. News of the new investigation broke 3 days later, and the media frenzy was even more intense than during the original trial. Headlines screamed about new evidence and shocking revelations, and justice reopened. Legal analysts debated whether Ethan could be charged with additional crimes after already being convicted and sentenced. Defense attorneys not connected to the case argued this was prosecutorial overreach, double jeopardy, a witch hunt against a teenager who'd already been convicted. But public opinion, particularly in Philadelphia's black and brown communities, strongly supported the renewed investigation. If Ethan had lied, if he'd manipulated evidence, if he'd been even more culpable than the trial had revealed, people wanted him held accountable. Gerald Martinson, Ethan's attorney, held a press conference denouncing the charges. This is a politically motivated prosecution, he declared. My client has already been convicted and sentenced. He's serving time in state prison for crimes he's accepted responsibility for. The DA's office is now trying to pile on additional charges based on the uncorroborated claims of a co-defendant who has every reason to lie, who's been offered a sweetheart deal to testify against my client. This is not justice. This is persecution. But behind the scenes, Martinson knew they had problems. If Connor testified credibly about the shoe swap, about Ethan's actual participation, about Richard Caldwell's witness intimidation, it could add significant years to Ethan's sentence. And if the jury believed Ethan had lied under oath during his testimony, which he hadn't given, but which his statements to police and his attorney's representations constituted, they might seek perjury charges too. The preliminary hearing for the new charges took place 3 weeks later in the same courthouse, though with a different judge. Judge Holloway had recused herself, citing her previous involvement in the case. The new judge, Thomas McNally, was younger than Holloway, barely into his 40s, with a reputation for being smart but unpredictable. Some lawyers loved drawing McNally, others dreaded it. There was no telling which side he'd favor on any given day. The hearing was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with overflow spectators directed to a secondary viewing room where the proceedings would be shown on closed-circuit TV. Media from across the country had descended on Philadelphia, sensing this case was about to explode into the national consciousness in a way that even the original trial hadn't quite achieved. Marcus sat in the gallery with his mother, watching silently. He'd been briefed on the new evidence, on what Connor was prepared to testify. Part of him felt validation. Ethan had been even more culpable than anyone knew. But part of him felt exhausted. How many times would he have to relive that night? How many more legal proceedings would he have to endure? The prosecution called Jordan Webb as their first witness. Jordan took the stand looking nervous but determined, dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks, trying to project maturity and credibility. Reynolds walked Jordan through their investigation, the photo analysis, the discovery of the shoe size discrepancies, the connection to the charity donation. Jordan was articulate and precise, sticking to facts rather than speculation. Martinson's cross-examination was brutal. "Mr. Webb, you're not a forensic expert, are you?" "No, sir." "You're not a detective." "No, sir." "You're a high school student who decided to play amateur sleuth." "Is that accurate?" "I noticed something that seemed important and brought it to the authorities' attention." "You noticed that teenagers sometimes change what shoes they wear." "How revolutionary." "Objection," Reynolds called. "Argumentative." "Sustained." "Get to a question, Mr. Martinson." "Mr. Webb, have you ever been questioned by police for hacking into the school's computer system?" Jordan's eyes widened. "That was a misunderstanding. I was helping the IT department." "Just answer yes or no. Were you questioned by police?" "Yes, but..." "And didn't that incident result in you being suspended from school for a week?" "Yes, but it was later determined I hadn't done anything wrong. The suspension was reversed." "But you admit you accessed computer systems you weren't authorized to access." "I was trying to help." "Just like you're trying to help now by constructing elaborate theories about shoe swaps and evidence tampering. Isn't it true that you're obsessed with true crime, that you run a YouTube channel analyzing famous criminal cases?" Jordan shifted uncomfortably. "I have an interest in criminal justice. An interest that's led you to insert yourself into this case to seek attention, to construct conspiracy theories." "Objection." Reynolds was on her feet. "Counsel is testifying, not questioning." "Sustained." "Mr. Martinson, ask questions or sit down." But the damage was done. Martinson had planted seeds of doubt about Jordan's credibility, painting them as an attention-seeking teenager playing detective. The prosecution's case rose or fell on Connor O'Brien's testimony. Connor took the stand looking smaller and more vulnerable than he had in their interview. Prison had not been kind to him. He had a fading black eye, and Reynolds later learned he'd been in a fight with another inmate who'd recognized him from news coverage of the case. Reynolds walked him through his direct testimony carefully, establishing the shoe swap, Ethan's instructions, Richard Caldwell's threats. Connor spoke quietly but clearly, making eye contact with the jury, his remorse evident. "Connor, I want to be very clear about this," Reynolds said. "When you wore those black and red sneakers during your arrest, the ones that looked like Ethan's signature shoes, whose shoes were those originally?" "They were Ethan's shoes. He bought them to give to me specifically, knowing they'd look like his usual shoes. That way if anyone saw them in the video, they'd think it was Ethan participating." "And what happened to your actual shoes from that night?" "I gave them to Ethan. He said his dad would destroy them." "Did you see them being destroyed?" "No. Ethan took them and I never saw them again." "Connor, during the actual assault, who was wearing the black and red shoes with yellow laces that appear in the video?" "I was. Those were my shoes, my laces." "And the person wearing those shoes is seen kicking Marcus Johnson in the face, causing the injury that destroyed his vision. Was that you?" Connor's voice broke. "Yes, that was me. I did that. And I have to live with it for the rest of my life." "Did Ethan participate in the physical assault beyond just directing the others?" "Yes. He kicked Marcus multiple times. He hit him with a bat. He was way more involved than he ever admitted. He lied about just standing there directing things. He was in it, really in it." Reynolds let that sit for a moment before continuing. "After you were arrested, did Ethan's father, Richard Caldwell, contact you?" "Yes. He came to see me in jail." "What did he say?" "He said if I testified against Ethan, his lawyers would destroy me. He said they'd make sure I got the maximum sentence. He said they'd go after my family, make sure my mom lost her job. He said the Caldwells had connections and I'd regret crossing them." "Did you feel threatened by this conversation?" "Absolutely. I was terrified." "Is that why you didn't testify during Ethan's trial?" "Yes. I was afraid of what would happen to me and my family." Reynolds nodded. No further questions. Martinson stood for cross-examination, and his strategy was immediately clear. Paint Connor as a desperate criminal willing to say anything to reduce his own sentence. "Mr. O'Brien, you're facing 25 to 40 years in prison if convicted on your current charges. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And in exchange for this testimony, the prosecution has offered to recommend 12 to 15 years. Correct?" "Yes, sir." So you have a powerful incentive to tell the prosecution what they want to hear, don't you? I'm telling the truth. The truth is you remember it 6 months after the fact, after you've had time to think about how to minimize your own culpability and shift blame to my client. No, sir. I'm telling the truth about what happened. Mr. O'Brien, you admitted moments ago that you kicked Marcus Johnson in the face, causing permanent damage. You're the one who destroyed his vision, not my client. Correct. Connor's face crumpled. Yes, I did that. And yet you're sitting here trying to claim that somehow my client is more guilty than you, even though your foot literally blinded another human being. I'm not saying I'm not guilty. I'm saying Ethan was more involved than he admitted. Or maybe you're saying what you need to say to get a reduced sentence. Maybe you're willing to lie about my client to save your own skin. I'm not lying. Martinson pulled up the video footage. Let's watch this again. This is the moment you claim my client kicked Marcus. Can you point out where in this frame Ethan is? Connor squinted at the screen. The video was chaotic, bodies moving, the camera angle poor. I can't see him clearly in this frame, but I know he was there. You know he was there, but you can't actually point him out in the video. How convenient. The camera wasn't capturing everything. Just because you can't see him in this specific frame doesn't mean he wasn't participating. But it does mean your testimony is uncorroborated by the video evidence, doesn't it? Connor didn't answer. Martinson pressed his advantage. Mr. O'Brien, isn't it true that you told another inmate, a man named Marcus Reeves, ironically enough, that you were going to tell the prosecutors whatever bullshit they wanted to hear to get out faster? Didn't you say those exact words? Connor's eyes widened. No, I never said that. We have a sworn affidavit from Mr. Reeves stating that you did. Would you like to see it? Reynolds stood. Your Honor, this is the first we're hearing of any such affidavit. If the defense has impeachment evidence, they need to provide it to us during discovery. Judge McNally looked at Martinson. Counsel? The affidavit was obtained yesterday evening, Your Honor. We're providing it to the prosecution now, and I'm happy to reserve the right to recall this witness after they've had time to review it. Reynolds took the affidavit, her mind racing. If another inmate was willing to testify that Connor had talked about lying, it would destroy his credibility. They'd need to investigate this Marcus Reeves immediately, find out if he was credible or if the defense had coached him. The hearing continued for 3 more days, with additional witnesses and forensic experts testifying about shoe prints, about the timeline, about the possibility that evidence had been destroyed. The defense called character witnesses for Ethan, arguing that the new charges were baseless, that the prosecution was relying on the word of criminals trying to reduce their own sentences. Finally, Judge McNally ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on charges of tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, and witness intimidation. Ethan would face a new trial, this time on charges that could add 10 to 20 years to his existing sentence. The media coverage was relentless. Legal experts debated whether the new charges amounted to double jeopardy. Civil rights activists celebrated what they saw as accountability for wealthy defendants who manipulated the system. Defense attorneys warned this set a dangerous precedent. And in a state prison 90 miles outside Philadelphia, Ethan Caldwell sat in his cell reading the news coverage, feeling the walls closing in even tighter. His father visited 2 days after the ruling. Richard Caldwell looked like he'd aged a decade. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame, suggesting weight loss from stress. His eyes were rimmed with red, and his hands trembled slightly as he sat across from his son in the visiting room. The lawyers say we can fight this, Richard said without preamble. We can appeal the judge's ruling, argue double jeopardy, drag this out for years. Dad. Or we can negotiate. Martinson says he might be able to work out a deal where you plead guilty to reduce charges, maybe add 5 years instead of 20. You'd be out by the time you're 40 instead of 55. Dad, stop. Richard looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time in months. The boy who'd sat at dinner tables making racist jokes while Richard laughed uncomfortably but said nothing. The teenager who'd come home bragging about putting that scholarship kid in his place, while Richard told him to be more careful, not to make waves, never addressing the underlying hatred. The son he'd protected and enabled and failed in every way that mattered. Tell me the truth, Richard said, his voice breaking. Did you do what they're saying? Did you set up Connor with the shoes? Did I really threaten his family when I visited him? Ethan looked at his hands. They'd seemed so clean at trial, no blood, no bruises, no visible evidence of what they'd done. But they weren't clean. They'd never be clean. Yeah, he said quietly. I did all of it. Why? Why would you? Because I wanted Marcus gone. I wanted him hurt so badly he'd never come back to Lincoln, so every other scholarship kid would see what happened and know their place. And when it went further than I planned, when I realized we might all go down for attempted murder, I panicked. I figured if I could make it look like I just directed things, if I could put the physical violence on the others, maybe I'd get a lighter sentence. So you used your friends. They weren't my friends, Dad. They were people I could manipulate into doing what I wanted. Just like you manipulated Connor's mom by threatening her job. Just like you've manipulated everyone your whole life with money and lawyers and connections. Richard recoiled as if he'd been slapped. I did that to protect you. You did that to protect yourself. Your reputation. Your business. If I went down for a hate crime, it would hurt your real estate deals, your country club membership, your political donations. That's what you cared about. Not whether what I did was right or wrong. That's not. Richard stopped himself. Because Ethan was right. Every decision Richard had made, from hiring expensive lawyers to intimidating witnesses to donating to charity for good publicity, had been about protecting the Caldwell name and wealth, not about justice or accountability or teaching his son the difference between right and wrong. I failed you, Richard said finally. Yeah, you did. And I failed Marcus. And myself. And everyone who thought I was better than I am. They sat in silence for a long moment. What do you want me to do? Richard asked. I want you to stop fighting this. Tell the lawyers to work out a plea deal. Let me plead guilty to the new charges, accept whatever additional sentence comes, and actually take responsibility for once in my life. Because if this goes to trial, Connor's going to testify. Jordan's going to testify. The jury's going to see even more evidence of what a monster I am. And honestly, Dad, I don't think I can sit through another trial, watching videos of what I did, hearing Marcus describe his pain, and pretending I'm somehow less guilty than everyone knows I am. Richard wanted to argue. Every instinct told him to fight, to protect his son, to use every resource available to minimize the damage. But for the first time he stopped and thought about what that had cost. What it had cost Marcus Johnson. What it had cost his son's soul. What it had cost his own humanity. Okay, he said. I'll tell Martinson to negotiate a plea. The plea negotiations took 3 weeks. The prosecution wanted Ethan to plead guilty to all charges and accept an additional 15 years. The defense countered with guilty pleas to reduce charges and an additional 7 years. They settled somewhere in the middle. Ethan would plead guilty to evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. The witness intimidation charge would be dropped as it was primarily Richard Caldwell's conduct, not Ethan's, and he would receive an additional 12 years to run consecutive to his existing sentence. Total time. 27 to 42 years with possibility of parole after 27 years. Ethan would be 44 years old at his earliest possible release date. The plea hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in mid-December. It had been nearly 7 months since the attack on Marcus Johnson, and Philadelphia was decorated for Christmas. Lights and garland everywhere, people shopping and celebrating and living their lives while the justice system ground through its procedures. The courtroom was less packed this time. The media was still present, but the crowds had thinned. The initial sensation had faded, replaced by a grim recognition that this case was just one example of a larger problem. Systemic racism, privilege, the way wealth and whiteness could insulate people from consequences until finally, occasionally, it couldn't. Ethan stood before Judge McNally, his hands cuffed in front of him, wearing a prison jumpsuit. Martinson stood beside him, looking defeated. This wasn't the outcome he'd wanted, but it was the outcome his client had demanded. Mr. Caldwell, Judge McNally said, you're here today to enter guilty pleas to charges of tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. Do you understand these charges? Yes, Your Honor. Has anyone forced or coerced you to enter these pleas? No, Your Honor. Have you had adequate time to consult with your attorney? Yes, Your Honor. Then I'll hear your plea. To the charge of tampering with evidence, how do you plead? Ethan took a deep breath. Guilty. To the charge of obstruction of justice, how do you plead? Guilty. Judge McNally made notes in his file. Very well. I accept these pleas. Before I impose sentence, does anyone wish to speak? Monica Reynolds stood. The people have a brief statement, Your Honor. We believe these pleas represent an appropriate resolution given the defendant's acceptance of responsibility. We recognize that no sentence can fully compensate Marcus Johnson for what he's lost, but we believe justice is being served by holding the defendant accountable not just for the assault itself, but for his calculated attempts to manipulate evidence and obstruct justice. Judge McNally nodded. Mr. Martinson? Your Honor, my client wishes to make a statement before you impose sentence. Very well. Mr. Caldwell, you may speak. Ethan turned to face the gallery looking for Marcus. It took him a moment to find him. Marcus was in the back row trying to be inconspicuous. When their eyes met, Ethan saw nothing there. No anger, no satisfaction, no emotion at all. Just a blank emptiness that was somehow worse than hatred. Marcus, Ethan said, his voice shaking, I know sorry isn't enough. I know nothing I say can fix what I did to you. But I want you to know that I understand now. I understand that I nearly killed you because of the color of your skin. Because I was raised to believe that people like me were better than people like you. Because I was taught, explicitly and implicitly, that the world belonged to me and people like you were intruders who needed to be put in their place. He paused, fighting tears. I destroyed your life. I took away your scholarship, your health, your future. I took away your sense of safety in the world. And I did it with calculation and premeditation and cruelty. Not in a moment of anger or poor judgment, but as part of a deliberate plan to hurt you as badly as possible without killing you. And then, when I got caught, I tried to manipulate the evidence to protect myself. I used my friends. I let my father intimidate witnesses. I put protecting myself above taking responsibility for what I'd done. Several people in the gallery were crying now. Diane Johnson held her son's hand tightly. I can't take back what I did. I can't give you back your health or your scholarship or the years of trauma therapy you'll need. All I can do is admit what I did, accept the consequences, and spend the rest of my life trying to be better than the person I was. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that you didn't deserve what happened to you. Nobody does. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He turned back to the judge, tears streaming down his face. Judge McNally was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice measured and grave. Mr. Caldwell, I've presided over many criminal cases in my years on the bench. I've seen violence motivated by greed, by jealousy, by mental illness, by circumstances beyond the defendant's control. But hate crimes occupy a special category of wickedness. When you assault someone because of who they are, because of their race, their religion, their sexual orientation, you're not just attacking an individual. You're attacking the very principle that all people are equal under the law. You're attacking the foundation of our democracy. He looked down at his notes, then back at Ethan. Your crimes were particularly egregious because they were calculated. You didn't lash out in a moment of passion. You planned for weeks. You researched locations, purchased weapons, created elaborate deceptions. And when you were caught, you continued to scheme and manipulate, trying to shift blame to others, tampering with evidence, obstructing justice. This demonstrates a level of moral bankruptcy that is deeply troubling. Ethan stood perfectly still, accepting the judgment. However, I do note that you have now, finally, accepted responsibility. You've entered guilty pleas. You've made a statement expressing remorse. Whether that remorse is genuine or tactical, only time will tell. But I'm willing to honor the plea agreement that's been negotiated. Judge McNally opened his sentencing file. On the charge of tampering with evidence, I sentence you to 8 to 16 years in state prison. On the charge of obstruction of justice, I sentence you to 8 to 16 years in state prison. These sentences will run consecutively to each other and consecutively to your existing sentence for the underlying assault. Total time, 27 to 42 years with possibility of parole after 27 years. The gavel came down. Additionally, I'm ordering you to participate in every available rehabilitation program during your incarceration. Anger management, racial sensitivity training, victim impact programs. When you come before the parole board in 27 years, they will evaluate not just your compliance with prison rules, but your genuine growth and change. If you emerge from prison the same person who entered, you will remain there. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. Bailiff, remand the defendant. As Ethan was led away, he looked back one more time at Marcus. This time Marcus held his gaze. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but perhaps a shared recognition of the weight of what had happened, of the lives that had been irrevocably altered by one night of racist violence. Outside the courthouse, Diane and Marcus Johnson gave a brief statement to the press. We're grateful that Ethan Caldwell has finally admitted his full responsibility, Diane said. This doesn't give Marcus back what he lost, but it does provide some measure of closure. We hope this case sends a message that hate crimes will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, regardless of the defendant's wealth or privilege. A reporter shouted a question. Marcus, how do you feel about Ethan's statement today? Do you accept his apology? Marcus took the microphone. When he spoke, his voice was steady. I don't know if I can ever forgive what was done to me. I don't know if Ethan's remorse is real or if it's just him saying what he thinks he should say. What I do know is that I'm still here. I'm still breathing. I still have my mother, my family, people who love me. Ethan tried to break me, but he didn't succeed. I'm going to build a new life from what's left. I'm going to find new dreams, new goals. And I'm going to use my story to help other people who've experienced hate crimes, who've been targeted because of who they are. That's how I'm going to take power back from what happened to me. The reporters erupted with more questions, but Diane gently guided her son away, toward their car, toward home, toward whatever future they could build together. The story ended as these stories do, with no perfect resolution. Marcus would carry the physical and psychological scars of that night for the rest of his life. He would struggle with PTSD, with vision problems, with the loss of opportunities that had once seemed limitless. But he would also find new paths, eventually becoming an advocate for hate crime victims, speaking at schools and conferences, using his experience to educate others. Ethan would spend the next 27 years in prison, with possibility of parole if he could demonstrate genuine rehabilitation. Whether he would truly change, whether his remorse was genuine, whether he would emerge from prison a better person, those questions remained unanswered. Some people used prison time for reflection and growth. Others simply became harder, more bitter, more entrenched in their worst qualities. The Caldwell family's reputation was destroyed. Richard's business collapsed as clients and partners distanced themselves. Patricia filed for divorce 2 years after Ethan's sentencing, unable to reconcile herself to what her family had become. They lost their mansion, their social standing, everything they'd built. Jordan Webb graduated from Lincoln Prep and went on to study criminal justice in college, inspired by their role in uncovering the evidence tampering. They occasionally visited Marcus, the two forming an unlikely friendship built on shared trauma and shared determination to create positive change. Connor O'Brien served his reduced sentence and was released after 8 years. He struggled to reintegrate into society, burdened by guilt and by the viral nature of his crimes. He eventually moved to a small town in rural Pennsylvania where no one knew his story, working construction and living quietly, trying to atone in whatever small ways he could. Dylan Marchetti, Trevor Hastings, and the others involved in the assault served their sentences and faced their own reckonings with what they'd done. And Lincoln Prep, faced with the undeniable evidence that they'd failed to protect Marcus Johnson despite repeated warnings, underwent a complete administrative overhaul. They implemented new anti-harassment policies, hired a full-time diversity coordinator, and established a scholarship fund in Marcus's name to support students from underserved communities. It wasn't justice, not really. Justice would have been Marcus keeping his scholarship, his health, his unburdened future. Justice would have been Ethan never learning to hate in the first place, never being raised in an environment where racism was tolerated and enabled. But it was accountability. It was consequence. It was a small example of the system working, eventually, imperfectly, to punish those who believed their privilege entitled them to destroy others without facing any repercussions. And in the end, that small example mattered. Because every time someone like Ethan Caldwell faced real consequences for hate crimes, it sent a message. Every time the system acknowledged that wealth and whiteness couldn't insulate you from justice, it chipped away at the structures of inequality that made such crimes possible. The shoelace, that small, seemingly insignificant detail that Jordan Webb had noticed, became a symbol of how carefully hidden truths could be uncovered, how the smallest pieces of evidence could unravel elaborate lies, how persistence and observation and a commitment to justice could expose even the most calculated deceptions. Years later, Marcus would sometimes think about that night in the warehouse. The fear, the pain, the darkness that had followed. But he would also think about the light that had emerged, the people who'd fought for him, the system that had eventually worked, the strength he'd discovered in himself to keep going even when everything seemed lost. He would think about Ethan too occasionally. Not with hatred, not with forgiveness, but with a complicated mix of emotions that he'd learned to accept as part of his healing. He would wonder if Ethan truly understood the weight of racial hatred, if prison had genuinely changed him, if redemption was even possible for someone who'd done what Ethan did. But mostly Marcus would think about the future, about the advocacy work he was doing, about the other survivors he was helping, about the life he was building from the ruins of the one that had been stolen from him. And that, in the end, was its own form of justice. Not perfect, not complete, but real. The justice of survival, of resilience, of refusing to let hate have the final word. The courtroom had closed. The cameras had moved on to other stories. The protesters had dispersed. But the ripples of that night in June continued to spread outward, touching lives, changing perspectives, adding one more story to the long, ongoing struggle for equality and accountability in America. And somewhere in a prison cell, Ethan Caldwell sat with his own thoughts, beginning the long, uncertain journey toward understanding what he'd done and who he might become. Whether he would succeed, whether he even wanted to, remained to be seen. But the shoelace had exposed his lies. And the truth, once revealed, could never be hidden again.